Yeah. Yes, we'll find a way.
Yeah, no, I love that I was questions there.
He said he gave me questions.
And again, if the committee members could make their way to the dais, please. Thank you all very much. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We make a point of trying to start as close to 1 as we can, given the challenges of pulling everybody together in the room. Just want to indicate for the record that this is the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals working meeting. And for Thursday, October the 13th, 2016, the proceedings are being taped. They will be available online, as have previous meetings. And I should just indicate, I'm going to call out the roll here, that of our 12 members, 11 are in their seats. Don Lane, Sam Hindy, Gary Waldeck, Marilyn Bernald, John Leopold, Joe Simidian, Dave Pine, Ann Wengert, Ed Bodorf, Bruce McPherson, and Larry Moody. Thank you. And we also have a number of our alternates who are here today, and I just want to thank them for being here and acknowledge their presence. A lot of them have made just an extraordinary effort over the last few months to participate, even though they get pulled in only occasionally. But thank you to Donna Lind, who I saw in the back of the chambers, Elizabeth Lewis, front and center, George Purnell, who I saw. Thank you, George, for being here. Jean Mordeau. John, thank you for being here. And Peter Otaki, I believe, just made his way in. So again, thank you to all of the alternates as well. Just want to recognize them for the record. We may be joined by others as the meeting goes on. Also, thank you to the 3 offices for our 3 members of Congress who convened the Select Committee. I think most of the committee members certainly know, but for members of the public who may not, we have benefited greatly from the assistance of those 3 offices. We have folks with us from those 3 offices, so our thanks to Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, Congresswoman Jackie Spear, and Congressman Sam Farr as well. Members, I think that brings us to the tentative agenda. Let me just ask, I do know that there is one change to the agenda. We had initially scheduled Councilmember Hindy, who has apparently become a city in the Bay Area named San Hindy. I didn't, sorry about that, Sam, and forgive the typo. But we were anticipating that there might be a presentation from Foster City. We're going to, at his request, delay that to a subsequent meeting. We look forward to making space and time for that at a subsequent meeting. So let me just double check with the committee that we're ready to go and delve into some follow-up to the September 29th Select Committee discussion, if you're ready and the agenda meets with your approval. Looks good? All right, then that takes us to, excuse me? I'm sorry, that takes us to Mark Adiego, who couldn't just slip in unobtrusively. We had to officially announce him and say thank you, and we are glad you found the last parking spot in all of Palo Alto, so appreciate that. All right, that takes us to the follow-up to the September 29th Select Committee discussions. Committee member requests. There were some requests still outstanding. In fact, I think we have a half a dozen of them today, Mr. Martin. So if you want to walk us through those and remind us what the request was, who it came from, and then share whatever information you think would be helpful, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And this, of course, is Glenn Martin from the FAA with Mr. May, his colleague, and Mr. Carnes as well. Thank you.
The only thing I'm not sure I can do is remember who they came from, so I may skip that part, and I apologize. If you want credit, please raise your hand.
Are we starting with higher vectoring altitudes?
Yes, sir.
I believe that was a question or comment from Ms. Wengert previously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the vectoring that I believe we're concerned about is the vectoring that you see. We've talked about the significant amount of vectoring done off of the Surfer. We've explained that the Bodega and much to the oceanic flights are all on vectors. So the The concept in this area is predominantly to vector airplanes. The question really was around what kind of shelves and things that you can put in there. So the system by itself will have areas in it in which we, stay above. Some will require as we vector to make sure we go underneath. So there are constraints within the system that already drive that. The question just specifically around how do you raise those altitudes, while there is some vectoring where perhaps the aircraft will come down to a lower altitude and then vector around the area, a lot of the vectoring is done, in what we call that stair-step method. The aircraft are only descended so far. They may be vectored around. Once the lower altitudes become available because other aircraft have left them, then they step them on down. It is this is particularly an area in which this is done a great deal. I think the implementation, perhaps, of artificial heights would be a challenge for us to put those restraints onto controllers. I think I don't think the controller is trying to get the aircraft down any sooner than it necessarily needs to be, but it's also all dependent on what exactly the traffic situation prevails. So it's very dynamic. It's very much driven at the air traffic controller's discretion in order to maintain either the lateral or the vertical separation. So, without getting into or understanding fully where we were trying to keep them higher, I think the concept of this is very complicated, and we have some concerns around the safety aspects of restricting the controller or limiting the controller's availability of airspace in order to sequence the aircraft as they do.
Brief pause for whispering. Okay.
So she's getting the correct file that's on the screen. So
Okay. So it's my understanding that the copy you have, you're getting a new one.
Those have been picked up. We're going to get
Okay,
new ones. We're
okay.
going to get the
All
right
right,
handouts
that's
for
what
the
he
right
was-
conversation.
That's
not
what he
to
was
worry.
filling me in on, so.
All right.
He wanted
But
to.
following up on this issue,
Okay.
Ms. Wengert, do you want to follow up at all on what you just heard, or do other committee members want to follow up on this? Please.
Just one follow-up on this, Glenn, to understand. Certainly, I appreciate the dynamic nature of what we're asking, but I would still perhaps repeat the question slightly differently from the perspective of, is there any ability to provide for some, what I'll call floor, relative to the minimum altitudes that are allowable even for the vectoring? Recognizing there could be exceptions made for safety reasons, but in terms of day-to-day traffic flow, is that a possibility?
I think the concept of building those is something, as I explained, we do. Those constraints exist in the system. The concept of building those around, in this instance, noise constraints, I don't believe is done anywhere. So it would be new. Like I said, there's concerns about that, but I mean, technically, yes, I think we could do that. Again, specifically what altitudes we could protect over the peninsula, that'd be pretty far down in the details to figure that out.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on this point? Then if not, we'll move on to the next point. But before we do, Mr. Martin, I noticed that I have overlooked two of our local Palo Alto City Council members who are here. Eric Filseth, thank you, Councilmember Filseth, for being here, and also Councilmember Liz Niss. So thank you to you both for making time in the day. Next item.
Okay. The next question, for whatever reason, I believe Mr. Waldeck asked this. I don't know why I remember that, but for some reason I think I do. There was a question around a route that was west of the Big Sur arrival path, arrival procedure. What we found was there was a procedure. Do we have a slide on this? No, that's not any of that. There we go. There was a procedure utilized, and it actually came off, I believe, the Big Sur VOR, and it was a Victor Airway that routed it, went to the Woodside VOR. And so it's a Victor Airway, and if there's a relevance to you, Victor Airways are only used up to flight level of 180 or 18,000 feet. So we could not substitute a Victor Airway for a procedure for coming out of higher altitudes with jets. You'd have to build something there. So it was not a arrival procedure per se into San Francisco, but it was a Victor Airway they used. Now, as we found out, can you go to the next slide? It was actually only used by one airline. It was a SkyWest flight, and it was back, the E-120 as it's designated there. I know it's an Embraer. I apologize, I'm not sure exactly the make and model name, but it's a turboprop aircraft, so it's going to have a couple of propellers on it as opposed to jets. So it was back when they flew those. They are no longer flying those. They've replaced those with their regional jets. So they come down in the Surfer today, much as everyone else. And so what we found in moving forward was that airway really isn't being used anymore like it once was.
Questions, Mr. Waldeck?
Just one, I'm going to move back a little bit. On your previous discussion of keeping airplanes higher and trying to get them back down, I think the answer is that you don't know how to do it. Is that the short and simple version of it?
Say that again?
You don't know how to do it?
I don't know how to do
How
what?
to keep airplanes higher that have been vectored and then bring them down at a later time? I think that's what you said in summary, but I want to make sure that's what it was.
Just to be clear what's happening here, I think Mr. Waldeck is going to the previous question before coming back to this one. Thanks.
Okay.
And I kept waiting for a punchline, and we kind of moved into this one, so I'm going to...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
So the answer is you don't know how to do it.
I think the answer is we don't do it. I think the
That part I
answer
knew.
is to do it for noise shelves would be something totally new. Technically, defining airspace and building procedures around that airspace, in this case, or over that airspace, is certainly something we do every day. I don't believe we have any noise shelves out there that we have done before, so it'd be something new.
Mm-hmm. But it is technically feasible?
I believe it would be, yes.
Okay, that's good. The other question that gets me almost to the same point, is it reasonable, therefore, if you can keep them high and then have them, in effect, dive bomb towards MENLO, could we actually raise a MENLO point and have them continue to dive bomb all the way into San Francisco?
If I can repeat back what you said is, can we come over MENLO higher?
That's exactly what I said.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I think that is what everyone's asking, and I think that's the challenge for us to design the procedure to do that, if that's your recommendation.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. Thanks.
So, meanwhile, back at the old flights, any follow-up questions on those? We were asking about the prop plane route 3 to 4 miles west of Big Sur. Any follow-up on that? All right, if not, then I think we'll say thank you for providing that response, and we'll ask you to move on to the next outstanding issue from our previous meeting.
So this is another one of those very fun, data-filled slide presentations here for the next few. So please stop me if we're trying to go too fast. But this is all of the hourly traffic counts presented to you in a couple of different ways. Try and get a feel, and I'll try and highlight some of the things I think you can draw out of these. So this one represents a month. It happens to be June of 2016, so it's 1 month worth of traffic. It's laid out, as you can see, from noon until 11 a.m. and then the y-axis would be the number of flights. So on the far left, at noon, I assume on the 1st of June, the blue line would represent departures. So in the noon hour, total in the month of June, there were right around 1,100 departures in the hour between noon and 1 o'clock. That everybody kind of follow along there. And then right next to it is the red. So in the noon hour on June 1st, between noon and 1 o'clock, there was about maybe 1,050 arrivals in that 1 hour. So that's what you're looking at for each hour in a 24-hour period. Total number of arrivals and departures, total for the month of June, laid out here in a 24-hour period to give you an idea of where the volume averages over that time period for the month.
Thank you, and excuse me, just for reference, this is an issue that, this speaks to questions that came from a number of committee members, but particularly Mr. Moody. I think you will recall you had said, could we get some data on, what's moving where, when, and so that's what this is. And when you get to the end of the presentation, Mr. Martin, if there's a sort of a way to wrap it up in a little bit of a bow and say, I think the takeaway is, and then I also think we're getting paper copies for members of the committee just in a matter of due time. So meanwhile, we'll work with the overheads just like everybody else. Keep rolling.
All right. So on this slide, I guess what you might draw from this is, as you can see throughout the afternoon, fairly consistent arrivals and departures up until about 7 p.m. And then you see where the arrival traffic certainly picks up, and there's a considerable increase in arrival traffic and actually a drop-off in departures. Then you can see right around 11 p.m. for all of those that just came in that leave tonight, they will all depart there in that 11 to 12 midnight hour. So no doubt some impact there at that hour with a fairly heavy departure hour from 11 to 12 o'clock at night. As you can see, right around 12 all the way through 6 a.m. is, roughly what we'd call nighttime hours, significant drop-off in both arrivals and departures. Some departures, as you can see, in the 1, 2, and 3 a.m. hours, and then you actually start in with some arrivals in 4 and 5 a.m., and we're going to talk about those a little more on the next couple of slides. And then coming into the new day, you can see you have a very heavy departure rush starting in between 6 and 7 a.m., continuing again, through 7 and 8 a.m. and building up until the middle of the day again. So this is total traffic averaged over the 24-hour period for all the traffic that flew in June of 2016. Okay, go down. This one a little more difficult to see, but we wanted to try and give you an idea of where they're coming from as they come through. So again, this is June 2016 traffic laid out over the 24-hour period, total number, but each hour is now broken. I'm sorry, this is total arrival traffic broken out for you over the 24-hour period. Much as the slide before was just the red color, I believe, this is now the red color broken out by arrival that they come in over that 24-hour period. So on the far left, you'll see the green line at noon that comes in over the board or over the diamond arrival. About 400 of those come in between noon and 1 o'clock each day. And then the blue next to it is the oceanic. The red next to that is the surfer. And then the purple line next to that is purple. So the surfer and the Bodega come in right around 300 arrivals in that hour on average each day. And then the diamond, of course, is up higher around 400.
Question over here. The question here is on the Bodega arrivals. Do we have a split between east and west so we get a better view of what that looks like?
Do we have the split of how many of those Bodega went east or west?
Yep.
We don't have that data, but but what we did run when we ran that is it's about 70% go west.
Understand. So it would be about 30% less here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, some other things to draw from this, as you get into the evening hours, right around 7 p.m., you can see again a fairly significant rise in the aircraft coming in on the Diamond. You can see some of the Oceanic come in the evening, and that builds up. The traffic, as you can see, does begin to die off again right around midnight. And then you have your low hours, certainly between between midnight and about 4 a.m. Starting at 4 a.m., you can see the increase in the number of Oceanic that come in. So we've heard a lot of concerns raised around some of the Oceanic aircraft coming in 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, and so forth, and that's just depicted here. And then you can see once 6 a.m. comes, it starts to build. Your departure or your arrivals really don't hit heavy here until around 9 a.m., and they're predominantly from the east around the Diamond arrival.
Please, Mr. Waldeck.
In the early morning hours, 4, 5, 6, 7, it looks like the Diamond approach isn't used as much as some of the others. And the question is, can airplanes from the east be shifted to that route instead?
Excuse me, you said airplanes from the east. I'm not sure that's
Well,
what you...
like Texas or points east as opposed, who are going to be coming, east to west. Can that be, right now we're seeing a lot of them on Surfer and Bodega, but if there, I know there's a certain number of airplanes coming from the east that also use those Surfer and Bodega routes. So the question is, can they be diverted to the eastern, southeastern part of the bay as opposed to the western part?
So
For those kind of arrivals.
Sorry. As I understand your question, I believe those are the target hours in which coming from the east is certainly more available. And I would also say that I draw from this between 7, 8, 9 p.m. and possibly 9, 10, 11 a.m. transitioning off the Surfer to the Diamond is not very likely. You have significant volume on the Diamond in those
I concur
hours.
with that. I was looking at the morning flights.
No, I was agreeing with you on the
Yeah.
morning.
Yeah.
And in contrast to that, I would say those other hours, it would be far more difficult to do
I
that.
concur. Thank you. And is there a way to make that happen?
Is there a way to, yes.
Is that a commitment or? Thank you.
Well, yes. And then we wanted to show you kind of over those overnight hours. Make sure, okay. So in this slide, now to not be too confusing, you're catching on to the numbers of flights, so we're going to switch up and do percentages now. So the y-axis has changed to percentages. So, and then the colors on the left, the blue line represents that during the daytime, which we have from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. for this slide, about 40% of your arrivals come in on the Diamond. And then from 1 to 6 a.m., a total of, or right around about 42, 43% of your arrivals come in on the Diamond arrival. The next one was the one I really wanted to point out is during the day, only about 4% of your Oceanic arrival, or the Oceanic arrivals make up only about 4% of your arrival traffic from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. But from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., it makes up almost 35, 36%. So a significant greater amount of the percentage of arrivals come in over the ocean. And as you saw in the previous slide, that's really that morning bank between 4 and 6 a.m. that's coming in that's driving that. Another one? So just some points I left for you on the slides here, as far as we looked at some of those departure pushes, and again, calling to your attention, there is a pretty good departure push between 11 and midnight. Certainly after midnight, the operations fall off significantly. The things that we would call like nighttime operations, some of the things that we believe may not be either safe or operationally feasible during the day, we believe could be, especially in the hours between 1 and 6 a.m. And
Mr.
then
Martin, excuse the interruption. I don't want you to go past that too quickly because I think it's a significant point.
Okay.
So you are underlining for the committee the fact that while sometimes you're in a position of saying that would be challenging, what you're now saying is it would be appreciably less challenging to make some of these accommodations during the high sensitivity evening hours simply by virtue of the smaller number of flights engaged, yes?
Yes.
All right, just so we take our nuggets of good news and savor them for a moment, okay? Thank you.
And thank you for helping me communicate that. And again, just to reflect to all of you, it has come to our attention that a lot of community concern is raised in those overnight hours. While that may not be as many flights, the impact of those flights seems to be very high. Okay. So that was the run-through of flight data, Mr. Moody. I wasn't sure if that answered all your questions, sir.
Then we had another issue, which I believe was raised by Ms. Bernal, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay.
Why don't you lay this one out for us?
So it's amazing all of the wonderful places you all have taught me in Northern California, and of all of them, guts may rank up there at the top. So here's what we found out about the guts fix. As you knew, the guts fix is on the approach procedure that we call
That's on the
Okay. I just wanted to clarify on which the procedure was. So it is on an approach. However, it is on an approach to runway 28 right. So that'll become relevant as we go forward here. So this is a concept in that it is probably maybe 3 or 4 miles into the bay as opposed to where MENLO sits. So the concept, I believe, here is in if you aim from Epic or a fix in that area at guts, can you stay higher until you get out over the water? I think that's the general concept. I think for us, some of the other things like a rock me or some of the other suggestions are very similar as far as how you can start a glide path or a glide slope. It's probably not a slope at that point, but a glide path. Starting from there and going back will mathematically give you higher altitudes over the peninsula and back out into the Monterey Bay. This particular one is a little more challenging given that it's only on an approach to 28 right. So in this particular case, the surfer actually has a transition from MENLO to guts, so that's actually already charted. So, but understanding that this would be, again, probably more something at night than during the day, because the aircraft coming down over the peninsula are intended to go to 28 left. We wouldn't be sending them to 28 right on a regular basis, especially with traffic converging with them from the Diamond arrival. So what we tried to depict here on the slide was just to kind of show you where the final approaches are. So up in the upper left, you can kind of see the SFO, and the X is trying to indicate the airport there. The red lines are indicating the final approach courses for both runways, the 28 left and 28 right runway. And then the RNP to 28 right, in which guts is on, and that is the only place guts is on that approach, is actually an offset approach into 28 right. So what I was trying to describe to you is that if you were coming down over MENLO, you would be in fact crossing over the two finals to get to guts. So operationally feasible, yes. If you were aiming for guts, I think the math would put you higher. During the day when we're trying to run both finals, I don't believe this would be operational feasible for us to try and go all the way over to guts from the west side.
It raises a question, an obvious question, I think, though, that if you were to aim for guts, I accept your premise, but why don't you create a similar point for 28 left instead of MENLO and have them fly to that? Create a similar point. I'm looking at the distance between the approach paths on I-28 left or right to guts. It looks like it's about a mile versus MENLO, which appears to be 3 or 4 miles. So if you just extended your turn point, just follow it out past MENLO and had your point at a point similar to guts on the bottom side, you might achieve the same thing, in effect raising the altitude over MENLO and lowering the noise. Have you considered that?
Let me make sure, because when you were speaking, I thought I understood the idea. Let me say it back to you so that so if I go down the wrong path, you can correct me. So I think the idea, as I mentioned, the RNP here to 28 right that has guts in it is what we call an offset. And as you can see that the course is in the yellow above the red finals to the runways. So I think you're asking, could you build an offset from 28 left that mimicked this approach?
Exactly.
Okay. So I will say to you, I've heard this, and it's been discussed, I think, for a long time. I don't believe we think we can run parallel offset approaches like this. I've never heard it agreed that that's actually something we can do safely. It's certainly an interesting ask, but I'd have to ask again. I mean, the criteria continues to change, but typically the concept of an offset for us is not normally to weave aircraft to the runway. That's not what we use an offset for. What we use the offset for is perhaps coming in, and when the aircraft is joining 28 left final, we will run this RNP to 28 right offset, because you can then descend them until they get under the scud layer, and then once they see each other, the aircraft on the 28 right offset merges over onto the final. If you didn't do that, depending on your weather minimums of the day, you would be staggering these on both runways. So the offset is generally used safely to work around a particular weather phenomenon, but allow us to come in roughly at the same arrival rate. So again, I don't want to be certain to tell you it can't be done. I know that that's not what we typically do, is run kind of parallel offset approaches. Just not aware of that.
Thank you.
Anything else on this item, colleagues? All right, if not, I think those are the 4 items that were under committee member requests. Yes?
Yes. Oh, I apologize. I do have another, if I may.
Please.
And I apologize. This was population density.
So I asked about this before okay, so, as did others, by the way.
So I believe you've seen these maps. They were color-coded. We tried to go back and further kind of clarify what the population counts were. So if you can read the legend, it gives you a little more detail as to the density and perhaps, or lack of density in which the tracks. So the yellow track coming up from the south, as you can see, it comes over Epic at the coast, is indeed signifying the surfer ground track. And then to the west of that, in a white color, coming just about through the S of Santa Cruz, is portraying the Big Sur track.
And colleagues, two things, and I'm going to try and call an audible here, if I may, which is we had seen, if I recall correctly, we had seen the color population graphs before. One of the things I thought would be helpful based on the conversation we've had about how many folks are we annoying, how badly we are annoying them, and how often are we annoying them, would be to attach some numbers to those colors, which showed us previously relative population, but didn't tell us what the actual numbers were. And I believe that the way the chart works, Mr. Martin, and you tell me if I've got it right, is that the number of people is inside each of those colored delineated areas is equal to the number of people that you've got in the chart. So that's per segment, block, census tract, whatever it is, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Then what I'm going to suggest is actually that we hold off on going farther into this until we get to 2C, where we're talking about Surfer and Big Sur, because I think that's going to fold nicely into that conversation. Okay? Good. Then I think that takes us to items 2B, 2BI, and 2BII. And coincidentally, colleagues, you'll notice that this reflects I think much of what is in the Palo Alto letter, frankly. So I think we can kind of cover two. These were items that were coming back anyway. As it happens, they were highlighted by folks in the Palo Alto letter, but why don't we ask Mr. Martin and his team to sort of walk us through these two conversations, first about the Menlo waypoint and then about the potential for redirected southern arrivals.
Okay. Which one are we doing first?
Can we start with Menlo?
You want to start with Matt?
Please. There we go.
Okay. So we brought this slide back trying to indicate, again, what you're seeing again is the pink is the oceanic arrivals coming in from the west. So we saw total is only about 5% of the arrivals. However, certainly higher percentage of the aircraft coming in, certainly in the 4 and 5 a.m. range. The green is indicating Bodega. If you come down from the top of the page, you can kind of see where it splits east and west, coming into and curls back into the runways. The blue on the right side is the diamond arrival. Again, it runs about 40% of the arrivals a day. And then down to the south is the orange for the surfer arrivals, and they make up about 30%. So trying to, no, you can go ahead, that's fine. Trying to recap, what we found is about 60% of the San Francisco arrivals pass in the vicinity of Menlo. The only procedure that has Menlo in it in this particular case will be the surfer. Neither the oceanic nor the Bodega file over Menlo. They obviously come into that area, but they don't file over Menlo. Of the aircraft that fly the surfer and then actually cross Menlo, it reduces the total amount to about 15% that actually fly down the surfer and cross Menlo. Once they're vectored off, we don't see them. They're coming in the vicinity of, but they're not being cleared back over the Menlo waypoint. Okay. So what we feel is adjusting Menlo itself is not necessarily as significant. Didn't say it wasn't important, make that clear. But we didn't want you to feel that a change in a request to change Menlo needed to be coupled with, I think, the overall concern of traffic in that vicinity because of the reason being only about 15% of the aircraft on the west side overfly MENLO, specifically on the procedure. Let me stop and make sure I didn't lose you on that one. Is that okay?
Everybody appears good.
Okay, so in trying to relate this to you, I think that the issue for the FAA, as we understand it, is at least twofold. I believe that the addition of the crossing restriction of MENLO at 4,000 that was designed into the surfer procedure draws those aircraft into this area at 4,000, and that is not desirable by the community. I think the issue is also that the community, I believe, feels more than that because of this low percentage, and therefore, if you want to address MENLO, I think the second half of this is you need to address that area. And I think to address that area, you're going to need to consider recommendations around the vectoring in that area, and specifically around the oceanic and the Bodega arrivals as well.
You didn't say it, but I'm thinking there's a unspoken hint there that involves altitude in the Woodside area as well as in the Bodega arrivals.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. Thank you.
If we can back up one slide. And I realize this is pretty far out, and I apologize, but if you can kind of focus in on the green flight tracks there, not because they're Bodega, but as you can see them kind of swath around MENLO. It's just important to understand that altitude increases on Bodega as they come south will have an effect on where they turn around and come back. It's just a point I wanted to draw from you. So if Bodega crossing the San Francisco airport and coming south at 20,000 feet interests you, understand they're going to be over Santa Cruz before they can turn back around and come back. So just be aware that the altitude...
At a higher altitude, though. I'm asking...
They've got to come down sometime.
Okay.
So-
And I think the obvious question then would be, where might that be?
Where would they need to come down?
Yeah.
Much as they do for surfer or an improved arrival from that direction. Yes.
Okay.
And I'm not at all suggesting that as an option. I'm just commenting to you to recognize that altitude requires distance to get down.
Got it.
The other thing that to bring up is I think there has been discussions around the Woodside VOR, the oceanic tailored arrival, and I think that ties in here as far as recommendations of ensuring that the procedures, certainly from the west, are at the right altitude over Woodside, but then tying in again, coming into the Palo Alto area as well.
So if I can, I'm just going to be utterly transparent here. I'm about to try and lead you someplace, so we'll see how that works. So looking at this particular display, if the pinkish oceanic flights, which are limited in number but particularly concentrated during highly sensitive periods in the late night and early morning, if those flights came in higher, something like the old 8,000-foot agreement that people have referenced, and if surfer was, whether it was surfer or Davy J, but the approach to MENLO was at a higher level, and if looking at that green area, we were able to move more flights to Bodega East rather than Bodega West. One would reasonably conclude that those three actions in combination would have the potential for some significant noise mitigation in the MENLO area. Is that a fair summary?
I've been beaten over the head by the word significant, so I'm not sure I can agree significant. All of the things you listed would be an improvement on the noise impact over the MENLO area.
And I don't mean to be flip with the next question, but since you're understandably resisting a word like significant, which might mean something different to one person than another, if we did all three of them, the impact would be greater than if we only did one of them.
Certainly, yes, sir.
Okay.
I agree.
Thank you. Believe it or not, I found that helpful.
Continuing on the line of questions from the chair, if we did all three of them, you mentioned that you need a space to bring the planes down. What kind of increase in flights will we be looking over the Santa Cruz Mountains in order to be able to do that?
I want to be sure you understand, I don't suggest you recommend we bring the Bodega down over the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I don't
I
recommend
think
that.
there's a little confusion here. The swinging by Santa Cruz was if we raised the elevation on Bodega.
Oh, okay, I thought we
That
raised
was-
the elevation on Menlo, so I got confused.
But when,
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, okay, I understand now, yeah, maybe I confused
no,
your
and
comment,
then
I
I
apologize.
switched from, okay, if you don't like that one, let's talk about Bodega East as opposed to Bodega West,
Yes.
which does not involve the potential removal to a different part of the world.
So if we're not talking about, if we take your good suggestion not to raise the altitude on Bodega, but instead look at the number of changes that were just asked about, they could make a difference, some difference in the Menlo vicinity, but doesn't mean that we'll see increased flights in Santa Cruz.
So for me, I don't know if, I guess I have this picture in my head, there's two ends of this, right?
Yeah.
And it's certainly, and I think you can attack both ends, I guess, is my feeling on this. So I don't think raising the crossing altitude at Menlo means you change the altitude at Epic, because you have to.
Yeah.
Okay? I think if you were able to raise the altitude at Epic, it doesn't mean you have to change the altitude at Menlo. I think those are two separate, certainly significant issues, two separate things to think about. I'm kind of leaning toward your thought, both need to go up, but that's where I'm at with it. The one caution that I have on that is there is a lot of concern around the speed break issue. So again, I just caution you coming in, they're raising both seems to be in the interests of the community. I just don't want us to feel we can go so high up coming in that the need to slow down over Mid-Peninsula now becomes aggravated or greater. So that's where that angle is what we need to work with, what we'll use industry for to find, if there's a sweet spot, what is it that they can do without forcing themselves to have to break.
Thank you.
We are still on 2BI, that's the Menlo waypoint. Others? Mr. Waldeck, thank you.
Mr. Martin, if I've heard you right, I heard you say that Menlo and EPIC could both be raised. And I was questioning if that's true, then where does this 3-degree angle come from? Because that's certainly going to change the angle. And so I'm wondering how all that fits. If you can do one or the other or both, why haven't we done that? That's the first question. I got a couple here.
So the 3-degree glide slope is that final approach path significance.
Understand.
That higher than that is, as I understand, is what we would call a destabilized approach. It puts the aircraft in a less than, really in a less than safe predicament. In a stabilized approach, the aircraft is approaching the runway at a rate that it's under control, and if things should change, they're in a position to make alternate
Right.
decisions, okay?
But
So
in
that's what I
raising-
mean by stabilized approach, is what I mean.
Yeah, I
okay?
understand, but my question then, it then goes, if you say you could raise the MENLO and the EPIC, one or the other or both, doesn't that change that angle? I think it would.
Well, so let me back up. So you understand a stabilized approach on the final approach course, okay? I don't think we are as stringent on that 3 degrees running all the way to Epic. Follow me?
I do. I think I do.
Now, if we're to optimize, which is right, wrong, or indifferent, the intent of Surfer, the team that worked that optimized that at the right angle, which I don't think it was a solid 3, but I think it was even a little lower than on certain parts of it. But the window, as we know, was 10 to 15 at Epic. The window they come through altitude-wise, 10 to 15,000, right? So is there a way to lessen the efficiency of that glide path? Let's, for the sake of this discussion with you and I, let's leave MENLO there for a minute. Is there a way to adjust the glide path coming to MENLO at a rate that improves or lessens the impact on the community? Follow me? Yes.
I do.
From the end of the runway to the point that they join the final, we will want them at or below a 3-degree glide path to the
Makes
runway.
sense to me.
Does that
Yeah, I got it.
help? Okay.
Okay, now the follow-on to that is this. In our last meeting, we learned of a paper written by a couple of Stanford guys, which brought into focus this noise concept of clean airplanes versus airplanes with everything hanging out, dirty airplanes. And I want to give you just a little vignette, because this, I think, is important to everybody here. Over the weekend, we had a little thing called Fleet Week. It's called an air show. And one of the things they had at that air show was a 747. It flew right by Aquatic Park. It started out over the Golden Gate, clean. Couldn't hear it. I'm a quarter of a mile away, I couldn't hear it. He went around and came back, and this time he put his slats and flaps down. You can hear it a little more, still a glide. And the third time back around, he made 3 passes this way, was very interesting to me. He had the air brakes on, he had the flaps and slats down, and in order to hold the glide slope that he had a power up, which is exactly the circumstance we're talking about in the entry point from roughly EPIC to Boulder. Okay? Noisy as it could be. And it brought into focus that paper that I referred to last time, which is, it's a 6th power when you dirty up an airplane versus virtually a clean one. The difference was astonishing. So I posed to you a question. Out just north of Monterey, there are 2 waypoints. One is Angie, one is DD, I forgot what the name of it is. They're on 2 different paths. Why doesn't the procedure start there and slow down these airplanes, which is what they're really trying to do, before they get to points like EPIC? So it's all over the bay, and now they can drop the speed brakes and just glide right in on the existing glide path, or maybe even a higher one, and really cut down this noise, because that X to the 6th function of a dirty airplane is significant. Just put it over the ocean. Can that be looked at? That's my question.
I think the answer to your question is, perhaps Could be a large part of what the concern has been all along. If the aircraft were able to stay in the optimal profile descent and as you described, clean, we do believe there is a noise, a far less noise than the dirty airplane. We do know that they have been using their speed brakes, and we certainly are aware from the input that it's occurring, after they come back on land. So getting to your question, I think it certainly needs to be looked at. I think it's a good reason to revisit that whole procedure to figure out what can we do. We know the Class B has some effect because we're issuing, we're essentially taking them off the OPD. We know that the vectoring has some effect that we think we can work towards. So I think your question is spot on. We have to figure out why that's happening and where can we shift that. But I think it's somewhat procedural bound. I think we need to review and analyze that procedure to figure out how to shift that is our thing. Understand, not getting out of it, but understanding as much as a controller would like to say, put on your brakes, that's really not, we can change their speed, but the issuance of speed brakes, the issuance of flaps out is at the pilot discretion. We don't make those calls for them. So some of these reasons that they're doing it are to achieve the instructions we're giving them. But the one-to-one correlation isn't there. I think the solution is the right procedure. It doesn't require the instructions we're issuing to take them off of it, and it's ensuring that those kinds of things are addressed in that descent so that the pilot isn't put in a position to do it.
Still on 2BI. Anything else on this item? I see Mr. Moody reaching for the microphone.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Martin. So the chair made a recommendation or a suggestion about, if we create some activities on two different lines that potentially that the MENLO point could receive some relief, right? Is that true?
If I said it, I feel sure it's true, Mr.
Right.
Moody, but,
So,
but is it accurate as well, maybe?
Right.
Is a,
so the three things that he mentioned, are you asking me, did I feel those would make improvements in the MENLO area?
That's correct.
and
Yes,
just
sir.
to recap,
Yes, sir.
the three things were raising the oceanic altitudes along the Woodside track, flipping more flights from Bodega west to the east, meaning over the bay rather than over the peninsula, and raising the altitude on Menlo. I think those were the three that I ID'd.
So the raising of the altitude for MENLO, does that mean we will once again be over 5,000 feet on the approach to the SFO, or would we remain hovering around 3,500 to 4,000?
So as you can see the aircraft that are in the vicinity of MENLO, and so you can't see all the colors anymore, but right around the vicinity of MENLO, if you grab all of those flights and you average them together, it's right around 4,500 is what they're around the MENLO waypoint. Okay?
Is there a potential to get over 5,000?
Is there a potential to get over 5,000? Was that your question?
Yes, that's my question.
I think the trick here is that how certain is that, if we consider from Epic to MENLO to the final as a straight line, I don't know for sure that it's an absolute straight line, but if we consider that, right? The concern I have is around the glide slope intercept angle. So any turns to the right would increase that angle to turn back to final. That makes sense? So there's concern in trying to intercept it further out. The further out you intercept it on final, the higher you could still be. So I think, again, there's a spot in there where we would be shooting for. But I think the consistency of aircraft in visual flight rules to fly it as at an average of 4,500 certainly means there's plenty above that. So I do think that that's probably the altitude, we would be shooting for.
Wasn't there an agreement pre-March 15th last year that the Menlo point would always be above 5,000?
I certainly am aware that existed. Unfortunately, I can't explain to you how the design team made that change. I mean, I don't know why that change was made, perhaps in contrast to that. I think that there was a considerable effort made through the process to establish as close to an optimal procedure. And, in contrast, the Big Sur, the crossing altitude of the Big Sur was down around Boulder, which is, I think, somewhere down around the Eddy place. So the crossing restriction there was at 6,000 feet. There was no 4,000 or 5,000 crossing on the Big Sur. So what I'm saying is, they kind of replaced the 6 by going forward, and the design team found that 4 at Menlo was the design criteria that met the optimal descent.
So at the risk of stating the obvious, this might be an opportune time to revisit that situation.
Right.
I believe that's what you're going to recommend, yes.
Thank you.
We're going to add mind reading to your list of skills, Mr. Martin. Thank you. Mr. Moody, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
I appreciate the help and the leadership from the chair, certainly. So it's kind of interesting over the last couple of months how my East Palo Alto community has really become engaged in this conversation. And it's really because of the efforts of this committee as well as the outreach of many of the partner organizations on the peninsula who are providing leadership. And our city is becoming engaged. We're starting to realize that there's some, we're a noisier city as well as there's some public health issues that are impacting our community. And I think it's, that resonates with all 3 counties, right? The health aspect. So I just want to, speak in behalf of Menlo Park, Atherton, Palo Alto, East Palo Alto. When I asked the question, the Davy J route, what's the pros and cons for the peninsula? What are the clear benefits? Because obviously we're all getting inundated with a lot of information from a lot of different places, and I just want to get right to the chase. Are there some direct benefits for the peninsula communities if we were to adopt the Davy J?
And I think we're going to get to that question on our very next item. So if we could just wrap this one up, you are only, I think, half a step ahead of us. But anything else on the Menlo waypoint before we get to?
Yes.
Yes.
I think
we have a question from Mr. Pine, or now are we pointing? Yes, Mr. Pine, and then to Mr. Waldeck, please.
Okay. At the risk of asking a question that maybe everyone knows the answer to, going back to the idea of potentially raising both Epic and Menlo. So when we talk about raising Menlo, again, we're talking about for a surfer Davy J procedure, not for everything, as you've made clear in the past, I believe, not for everything that passes through the Menlo vicinity. When we talk about raising Menlo, it's really just for that, for surfer or Davy J. Am I right about that, or are we really talking about everything that flies through the Menlo vicinity?
And what I think leading up to today, I believe most of the conversation was around the Menlo waypoint.
Right.
What we were trying to make sure you understood was the Menlo is used by fairly low percentage of the flights coming in, and so today I was just expressing for you we certainly could take Mr. Moody's suggestion, but if we took Mr. Moody's comment to raise it to 5, I don't think we could wash our hands and walk out. That was my point, that there's such a high percentage of traffic in the Menlo area besides them.
Right.
So we need to continue to address the other traffic
Right.
coming in there. That was
So
my-
raise it to 5 means raise it to 5 on the surfer or Davy J procedure. When we say raise it to 5, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me just ask a piece of this question, if I may, to clarify. So looking at the screens that we have, or the handouts that we have, with what I call the green spaghetti bowl there, with all those Bodega West flights coming in, for example, does raising the altitude at the Menlo waypoint affect the altitude of those Bodega flights on Bodega West?
Not at all.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to clarify.
Good, just so we're clear on the answer to that.
Okay, and then on the final approach for the, flights for the surfer at AVJ that might be crossing Menlo at 5, it sounds like I believe you said that the descent to the runway would be feasible and safe, that the fact they're crossing at 5,000 does not preclude a safe final arrival. Or we
Yeah,
have confidence
to be
in that?
specific, we will not chart it at 5 if it's unsafe.
Of course, right. Okay. So another, yeah, okay, just to be clear, all right, crossing at 5,000 works vis-à-vis the final approach, to the best of your knowledge right now.
Are you asking, do I know that 5,000 works?
I'm trying to get a sense of your degree of certainty. If the planes today that are flying surfer cross Menlo at 5,000, I think I've heard you say they would have no problem safely landing at SFO. Or is that something yet to be further investigated?
That is definitely something to be further investigated, and some of it has to do with the tilt coming from Epic.
Okay. Okay. And then my final question was the tilt from Epic to an elevated Menlo. You don't know today whether that could be OPD. That kind of goes back to your prior point you made a couple of times about potential braking, and that's another. So there's a lot of uncertainty around, more uncertainty than perhaps I appreciated for asking these questions about the feasibility of raising Menlo to 5, the feasibility of raising Epic. We're optimistic, but there's still uncertainty. Anyway, that's the best I can frame it.
I would just say I have learned that the answer to many of our questions is it depends.
Okay.
That's kind of the.
Thank you for your patience.
No, absolutely. These are important. As we get closer and closer to recommendation time, I think it's ever more important that people tease out these issues at the second and third level. So, Mr. Waldeck, to you on this same Menlo waypoint conversation.
Just a couple of things about Menlo here. I have to share, I think everybody here knows this is probably one of the highest technologically competent areas in the whole world. And all of us have been flooded with information about what is and isn't, and usually well justified. So I'm looking at a chart here. It says that, and my point is that these charts tend to vary a little from what we've heard today, so I'm going to be alert to that. In 2011, the average altitude of planes in the corridor over Menlo was about 5,000 feet. As of September this year, it was 4,300 feet. So we've dropped 700 feet over Menlo. It's been a steady decline over these 5 or 6 years. At the same time, in 2011, we had 4,300 airplanes through the corridor, and now we're just a shade under 5,000 in the same time. So we've seen about a 30% increase in traffic over Menlo at a consistently lowering rate. And now I'm hearing that optimistically that there might be a good chance of raising that altitude again. Is there anything we can do about changing the traffic density and lowering that?
So I think the way I would answer that is, obviously, as traffic does increase in the use of the Diamond, because there's suggestions to push aircraft there.
Right.
One advantage could be that it's one less or many less aircraft on the west side over the peninsula. I think I think some of the, like the Bodega numbers, I think earlier when I showed you roughly 60% come in around MENLO, I think those are the challenges that, you know, bestow us to look at that and figure out why is it there's been this shift to the west side. So I do think there is certainly an opportunity to reduce that number. I think there is certainly an opportunity to appreciate that it's as traffic, you know, traffic is projected to grow. And I think the concern that I have, especially at this airport, is you have many hours of the day where that growth cannot be absorbed. So in some cases, the schedule is going to have to run later and start earlier. And that is my big fear for an airport like San Francisco. So I think you're spot on. I think the numbers need to be either balanced or certainly reviewed. I think we need to understand exactly why those things occurred and what we can do to move them as necessary to try and reduce the number. Again, I don't know what data was able to be pulled for that, so, you know, I'm going off what the numbers were you gave me.
Anything else on the Menlo waypoint before we move on? Yes, Ms. Wengert.
One follow-up question I have for you, Glenn, and it goes back, and I think probably the best way to see this is on your population counts near the Big Sur and Surfer slide. And it relates to the Menlo altitude, but I think a good graphical way to sort of look at what I'm going to ask is, I know you mentioned, I think today in part of this discussion, that this altitude at the Swells waypoint, which is the next southernmost waypoint to Menlo, on the old Big Sur route was 6,000. And to the extent that that is reinstituted, because I see that they're now separated obviously between the old and the current route, but assuming that we're within a very tight box there, if it's reinstituted at 6,000 under the new procedure or any other future procedure, would that have any positive impact to keep that Menlo waypoint higher, or the area around Menlo?
I think considering a procedure in which we looked at a crossing restriction further south than Menlo, as you described, I think what I would say to you, I think there's a couple of things that interest me with that. Today, as you know, or as you probably feel and sense, it's possible to come over a Woodside VOR at 8, drop right to 4, and fly all the way to the final at 4. I think a fix such as you suggested up around Swells at 6 could alleviate that concern from Woodside to that fix. You follow me? So I think there's gain in that. I think following that, I wouldn't suggest to you a crossing restriction around Swells or in that area at, say, 6,000 that potentially puts them in the Palo Alto area below 4 or at 4 for that matter. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I mean, that altitude, while it would help perhaps between Woodside and that location, would be intended to ensure that they were up higher at 5,000 into the over the Palo Alto area till they reach the water.
And if I confused you in my question, it was much more towards the Palo Alto, Menlo area than Woodside.
Yeah,
so
well, I
that
just
the
wanted to say
altitude may be too
there's
low.
advantage to that interim altitude location,
Right.
was all I wanted,
Right.
a couple advantages.
Okay, that's really what I was driving at, particularly for the area of Palo Alto, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this item? Mr. Otaki, who is not Mr. Adiego, in case anyone had any doubts. Okay.
Mr. Adiego, Mayor Adiego has asked me to step in as his alternate, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to follow up on, if you could go back to the green bodega slide, spaghetti slide. We had this discussion about 15 minutes ago about the altitude of the bodega west. And I know at one point you used what I would call the extreme example of crossing SFO at 20,000 feet would push that U-turn further south. And I know my understanding is Bodega West crosses over SFO at something like 10 or 11,000 feet. So when you mentioned that, you were actually suggesting a extreme altitude
Yes, I was,
increase.
yes.
Okay, because what I was worried about is that sort of alarmed a lot of folks that, and I know that was not your intention, and I didn't want to leave that
Thank
off
you.
the table, that there is the potential of finding a slightly higher altitude on Bodega West, particularly as it makes its U-turn over Palo Alto, that might provide some relief or reduction in noise for those of us in the Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Portola Valley area that right now have been experiencing from the use of Bodega West. So if it is used, is there some modification, some increase in altitude that doesn't send the route so south, but at least provides some relief on the Bodega, when the Bodega West route is used?
The Bodega West is, the way that it works is they're actually on a vector after they cross over the San Francisco airport. So what that means is the aircraft is flying a particular heading. They're not headed anywhere, I guess, in absent other instructions, they would just keep going in that direction, right? And it's important to understand because now there's nowhere for me to assign them an altitude. Do you follow me? So, and I bring this up, so in a procedure, we could add an additional waypoint. You know, I'm just going to use my picture, west of Menlo where you see them coming south. And then at that fix, there could be an altitude crossing. You following
Yeah.
where I'm at? Okay.
In fact,
So
Stanford University is often used as it because it's a landmark in the
so
red
they can
tile
see it
route,
and
so-
they, yeah, I'll bet. So yes, that is certainly feasible to do. I agree that that altitude would work with the traffic pattern, you know, and again, I won't go to exaggerate it. So it would not force an unwanted change to the south, leave it at that. So that altitude could be determined. The only thing I caution you on is if we were to add that fix south of San Francisco, there is some dispersion on that vector heading coming south. So I think if that's a recommendation, I would ask, you know, specifically you with the knowledge, is there a thoroughfare or something there to come down? Because there probably would be some concentration to that route. And I wouldn't want to just, you know, do that right over down neighborhoods, right?
Fair enough, thank you.
All right. I think that may be the last call on the Menlo waypoint discussion. Before we move on, I'm pretty sure, excuse me, Supervisor? Mr. Moody?
Yeah, I'm just curious. So we're making all these recommendations about height and elevation and flight patterns and things of that nature. And I raised the issue earlier about, you know, my understanding was that that 5,000 and above was the Menlo Point agreement, right, with the FAA and through our Congresswoman Jackie Spears, her office. So how do we regulate all of this? I mean, who's going to be the watchdog agency to make sure that whatever changes we make or whatever recommendations, that they're adhered to and that the flight levels, right, are honored?
Well, if you're asking me, I'm assuming what you're asking is, do we intend to self-regulate? And I guess as much as we're required as a federal agency to do that, it would be. I'm not sure that would suffice for the committee or the public as being the watchdog group. If you're asking, is there a particular agency, all state, federal, and what I'm more familiar with, that reviews air traffic procedures for crossing restrictions and things like that? I'm not aware of anything like that.
So there is no department of making sure stuff happens the way it's supposed to.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, I think the
Thank you, sir.
appropriations committees have a lot of leverage to make sure things happen, but as far as getting down into crossing restrictions, things like that.
Two observations that I would share with, in response to the question with the entire committee. A little bit later in the agenda, we're going to talk about the where do we go from here part. Committee members and the public know that the plan is to release a discussion document, a discussion draft by close of business on the 21st. That document, as we'll discuss a little bit more later in the conversation, is designed to reflect areas where consensus appears to have developed at the committee level. There were two areas where there seemed to be consensus at the committee level. I don't want to, give away yet to be written consensus, but it did seem to me that there has been consensus around two things. First, the need for some kind of ongoing body after this body closes up shop in November. The second was the need for a compliance mechanism, and we had some conversations specifically about the fact that it's well and good to have rules, policies, procedures, understandings, memorandums, agreements, but that there needs to be some way to ensure compliance going forward so that we don't see the kind of creep or slippage that we perhaps have experienced in the past. Both of those issues will be referenced in the document, and I'm getting the impression that if they weren't, they would be raised by some member of the committee anyway. So both of those are areas. What that looks like, I think none of us can foresee as of today, but just to provide some assurance to you individually, but to the entire committee, both of those issues will be in the document that comes to the community and to the committee by the 21st. All right. Anything else on the MENLO waypoint? All right, if not, then let me just say, pretty sure I saw Councilmember Karen Holman in the back. Thank you for joining us. I think Jeff G. joined us, one of our other alternates. Thank you, Councilmember G, for joining us here today. And members, just because I'm curious, and I'm going to ask, we have a good crowd today. I expect the crowd will be growing as we get closer and closer to Decision Day. But how many of you are from Santa Cruz County? If you would just raise your hand quietly, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. How many of you are from Santa Clara County, which of course includes Palo Alto? Okay. And how many of you are from San Mateo County? Not too many, but a few. Thank you. And how many of you apparently wandered into the wrong meeting because you're not from any of those three? Anybody from anywhere else yet? The FAA. Okay, thank you. Who is learning our geography well? Okay, thank you. It was just curious to sort of see who's in the room and who's been tracking all this. All right, that takes us to item 2B II. Redirect southern arrivals to an eastern approach into SFO. Mr. Martin, you want to begin and walk us through this conversation?
All right. On the slide, as you're well aware, the current procedure coming in from the south is, of course, over the surfer, and it's indicated in the orange color there coming in, and you can see it coming up from the south, crossing MENLO. The area circling there is where some of that's being vectored off and so forth. The green coming down is the Bodega. You can clearly see from the north that that splits into the east and west legs. The blue is the diamond arrival coming in and coming into the final. The pink shaded areas is again the San Jose and Moffett fields, or it's probably just the San Jose Class C airspace that's around there. So I believe the concept is around trying to get in and come in from the east for the southern, from the southern airports. So we have another slide? Okay. Okay. let's go back to the other slide. So a couple things. One is the predominant arrival, as is maybe expected here on the West Coast, is from the east. So as we saw in the hourly counts earlier, you know, it's our opinion that there are several hours of the day in which it would just mathematically not be feasible for us to take them off Surfer and move them over to the Diamond Arrival. While we can add to the Diamond Arrival from Bodega, we think that that's, number one, procedurally established and much more effective for us. It's far less impact on the system, and it's something that the decision to move them over to the Diamond coming up from the south has to be made far earlier, so the distance they would fly would be far greater. And so during those compacted hours, we just don't find that to really be feasible. I think the hourly count certainly showed over the nighttime hours that the Diamond Arrival, while still perhaps the higher percentage of arrivals overnight, the volume is significantly lower, and I think the opportunity to do that is there. The real issues that I have with this is simply understanding exactly where this recommendation would expect us to take them. If, you know, the area certainly there near the bay is also populated, so moving them from one neighborhood to the next does concern us as far as who would be impacted and so forth. I know there's been discussions around that the altitude would resolve the issue because they would be higher. I think the math shows you that certainly coming in from the south and joining a long final or joining the Diamond from down south, they would be at a higher altitude than they are over Palo Alto. I'm just not exactly sure the folks over there find that altitude acceptable for them as we overfly them. So some concern over that. And then the only other thing that to caution is just to understand that unfortunately those folks are not in the room. So a recommendation like that, we would certainly want those people to be in any discussion around that before we would just simply move those flights over there.
Could I ask you, before I go to questions or comments, variation if we're looking at nighttime on the potential utility?
Yeah, I think the potential at nighttime is certainly greater, given the reduction in the volume over Diamond. So I agree with you. Nighttime is certainly a better option for that.
And is it the Faith waypoint? Am I remembering this piece that's been part of the conversation previously?
So if I could draw your attention to the slide, can you, if I said, can you see the triangle that is made in the blue down there, just slightly over the San Jose Class C airspace? Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
So right in that area where, can you see the cursor on that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know what you could see. So right in that corner there, right in that area, perhaps even a little further south, that's probably very, very close to the Faith waypoint. It's just if you extend the center line of the runway approach or final approach course, it just extends straight out like that.
All right, thank you. Comments or questions on this item? We're at 2BII, the potential for redirection of southern arrivals to an eastern approach into SFO. Mr. Waldeck.
You know, I'm looking at this Diamond Arrival, and I'm looking at the Surfer, or Big Sur Surfer, whatever arrival that is. And I'm relating back to an earlier question, is why not a different waypoint other than Menlo, a La Rockme or something like that under May. And the comment I received back was that it's terribly close to the Class C space in San Jose. And I'm looking at this extended Diamond Arrival to line up with the approach path to 28 right, and I see it's right there. And it looks to be, I presume it's higher than the Class C airspace, but it looks like it's a conflict there as well. So if you can do it in the diamond arrival, why can't we do it for the surfer arrival?
The question is really around coming over the top of Class C airspace?
Yeah, because I think it would still be over the top if you raised the elevation of that whole path, and it would work kind of nicely. Mr. May, when you mentioned this in Glenn's absence one time, you said you felt it got a little too close to the Class C, but the truth is it's still way outside of Class C, and so I'm curious why we can't do the same.
So, for me, there's a couple of things. The use of that airspace, as you can see in the orange, is done. So we do either go over the top or go through it when it's not being utilized. So I mean, there is a considerable use of those, of joining the final to 28 left much further south than just a MENLO to the final approach path. So that does happen. So formalizing that, again, I don't think my concern is so much is in needing to go over MENLO as exactly where do we turn east, or turn to the right, I shouldn't say east, but we turn to the right, and then what effect does that have on the communities that are affected then? That's my concern. I would also say that there are considerations within the operations in that Class C that going over the top of it from as far away as the diamond is a little bit different than once you get down into that Palo Alto area. Staying up from there is a little harder for us to get down. But again, we certainly do it. It's certainly possible. It's just the impact it has on moving that line to the east.
So it's in effect still off the table, or you're going to look at it?
I'm not going to not look at anything you recommend. So if you all feel that you know that is the option we need to look at, we're going to look at that. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Otaki?
So the bullet point you have in here, which is an increase in diamond usage.
Mr. Otaki, I'm going to stop you for just a minute.
Okay.
I apologize. And the reason for this is, in case this comes up later, I believe Mr. Adiego's alternate is technically supposed to be Mr. Grisilli. Am I remembering this correctly? Or are you the official alternate for him?
My understanding was it was based on a county-wide basis, not necessarily a specific alternate.
Let me tell you how I'm going to propose to handle this, and it's not an issue today, but it may be an issue in the future, which is why I want to be. Our understanding from working with the members of Congress is that each individual member of the Select Committee has a specific alternate, and that person is identified, that it's not any alternate within a county or congressional district. That being said, because Mr. Adiego has been so diligent, Mr. Grisilli has really not been engaged the way other members have. That's not a criticism, that's actually a shout out to Mr. Adiego. I do think we benefit from having the participation of the alternates, particularly those who have been regular participants. And so I want you at the table today. What I want to say, however, is that while I think a little flexibility is useful today, when the time comes that we're actually casting votes, the understanding is that if you are not a member of the Select Committee and you are not in the chair, then only the specific designated alternate will be there. So please take that in the glass more than half full way I meant it, which is I'm really delighted that you were here to be able to step into the seat so that we have a full complement as well as some additional perspectives. I did, however, want to raise the issue before we got to the voting part of the process a little later so everybody's clear what the rules are when we get to that time. So thank you for that, and please go forward.
And fair enough, thank you. The point says, the bullet point says an increase in diamond usage would decrease the usage of the Bodega East leg. So it's, and that is based on the following chart where you have the distribution of flights of arrivals into runways 28 right and 28 left that shows a predominant usage of 28 right from Diamond. And so then I do understand, many of our cities, like Palo Alto, for example, has asked, can you shift flights from Bodega West to Bodega East, and can you route southern flights to the east? What you're saying here is you can't do that because there's only a limited capacity on runway 28 right. That's the way I'm inferring from these charts. But my question is it possible to distribute some of those Diamond flights back to 28 left and thereby still be able to shift a lot of Bodega West to Bodega East, as well as some higher portion of Surfer over to the east, if you, and that would certainly create a lot of relief in this Mid-Peninsula area. So I simply wanted to ask, is it possible to distribute Diamond to both runways?
So I think in trying to read this slide, I think where we were pointing earlier, where the aircraft continue southwest and join right in where we thought Faith was, give or take, in that area. Are you familiar with what I'm saying? So most likely some of those are joining 27 left. So I wanted to point out that it's certainly feasible to change from the Diamond to the 27 left arrival. This is where, you know, in those times where we were, you know, this is probably happening during those heavy rushes from the east, okay? So we certainly can do it. It is feasible. As you try and favor 28 right, as you move Bodega to the east, as you try and move Surfer up to the Diamond, at some point you're hitting max capacity. So all of those things are feasible. It's just a matter of the traffic management to do it. And so yes, I agree that those things are all feasible to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question in this, while we're talking about this region of the territory here. In the past week, Palo Alto has, what's the word, engaged a consultant, and that consultant, Freitag, I think their name is, has offered a couple of new ideas in terms of how to get into the bay. One of them, which is right in the same region I was talking about, in the lower end of like Rockme. He's got the higher HIGHR approach, and it looks like that, based on what I read in his report, could be in fact implemented here safely, and further move some of that traffic out over the bay. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see that or not, but that report has a number of interesting ideas in it. I don't think I agree with all of them, but that looked like a very good one to certainly explore. Have you had a chance to see it, and if so, do you have any comments?
I don't have any specific comments to that suggestion. I understand the concept. I think all of that brings with it adjustments. And I think what we're here to hear is that the expertise of this committee has looked at that adjustment and feels it's best for the communities in this area. I mean, yes, we can build it. We're trying to make sure we don't build something that is so displeasing again. So I think it's possible to build those things. It's just there is adjustments to make that happen. I think I still feel some of the work is being done somewhat focused on this one arrival. And I think that's where we have a little skepticism of how laying their proposal in on other traffic.
Understand. I think what this is really, my question is really aimed at exploring other ideas on how to get to SFO. And by increasing the number of different routes, you increase the potential dispersion rate, which means the overall traffic over point A is similarly reduced. It's another way of, you know, sharing the wealth.
I think I mean, I guess my comment to you is when I look at the green and the orange there, you have a considerable amount of dispersion. So building more routes isn't in and of itself going to provide you additional dispersion.
We differ on that.
Okay.
Okay.
On this item, thank you, Mr. Botter.
This is a comment, it's going to cover both I was going to make the comment, we were talking about MENLO, but the comment is a general comment, it applies to both of these. And while I strongly support any efforts that we can try to make to relieve the pressure of Bodega West and move it to the east, I'm a big fan of that. But what I don't like about the last comments on Menlo, and especially with this redirect over the east, is and even there was the comment about fanning out the traffic on Bodega so it extends. We were talking facetiously about it into Santa Cruz, but my big concern, what I want to protect, and what I think we really need to be aware of is, and I think Mr. Martin has indicated this subtly, okay, and I just want to make it strongly, is anytime we make a move, we're going to affect somebody else, and we're not doing ourselves a favor. There's a challenge here, and I think there's some good ideas that we can have, and I think we've already made some. But I am concerned about when we start considering alternatives to, and I'm not a fan of sharing the wealth. I don't know that it does any good to do that.
Whoa, I step out for 60 seconds, and this is what happens, honest to gosh. So, can I ask you all, please hold back on applause, boos, hisses. I know it's meant to try and communicate your enthusiasm or lack thereof, but it really does have the potential to inhibit a free-flowing conversation. So I want every voice to be heard, but without the Roman arena quality that can sometimes be brought to these conversations. Back to you, Mr. Botter. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'm not trying to rise anybody. Everybody here in this panel is deeply concerned about coming up with a consensus, and we're all struggling with that. So bear with us. But the point is that living in Capitola, we're at that range of 11,000, 10,000 feet, and I don't want to minimize the fact that when we talk about moving a plane and we move it at 10 or 11,000 feet, it will affect the people underneath it. I mean, much more so are you affected at 4,000 and 5,000. We get that. But you are affected even at those other heights. So, when I look at something like this about coming in, branching off, coming into Diamond, I'm thinking these people are not even represented in this forum. And like I said, I really feel like we're making progress. And I know that we all have ideas about how we're going to make a suggestion. I think it puts the FAA at a bad place to say, well, we haven't looked at that. Well, we don't know about that because realistically, I don't know how viable of an option or what an improvement it's going to make. So I just want us all to remind ourselves, try to focus on not putting the noise anyplace else. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Hindi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to remind all of us that there are communities that are severely affected by arrivals on runway 28, right? And we are trying to, such as Redwood Shores and Foster City, and we are trying to minimize that impact by maximizing the use of 28 right. So any ideas or any suggestion looking at moving traffic to 28 left severely impacts those communities, and just want to make sure that we are all aware of that.
Thank you. Other comments on this item? No? All right, then we'll say thank you, and we will move on to 2C, which is revisiting the feasibility group number 2, transition Surfer Star back to the BSR ground track prior to Epic. And going to give the FAA a minute to huddle. And Mr. Martin, this might be a good time to find a way to fold in some of that population data that we were talking about earlier. Thank you. We're on the same wavelength there, apparently. And if you want to sort of share whatever is new and relevant on this topic, which is obviously central to the conversation. Thank you.
So really with the intent to just kind of tee this up, I think there's been conversation certainly about the impact of the Surfer. Based on the recommendations we received, we've created a notional DAVJ essentially over the ground track of the Big Sur. We've tried to analyze that for you here in population, along with some noise screening that we've done to try and show the changes around that. There was conversation last time around, is there even a better line than the two that are depicted? And I think that is really, as I recall, kind of how we left it off at the last meeting. And I think that the intent here was to kind of bring back the population data and then kind of continue that conversation around, what are the options and what are the ideas we have around what it is we're trying to accomplish here.
And we've looked at this slide, and this is one of those times when, at least for me, having a slightly larger handheld copy is helpful. And again, each of these areas is populated, we now know, consistent with the legend on the upper right-hand corner, yes?
So this is obviously trying to show you, pretty much the stretch from Monterey Bay up to MENLO, and then we're going to go in, and this next slide is going to be much further north. This is trying to just show you, it looks like Los Altos Hills into the East Palo Alto area there, and what the population counts were.
Okay. And why don't you march us through, there are a couple of other slides on this population issue, I believe. So if you want to tell us what it is you want to tell us, and then I'm going to go to the committee for questions and comments.
And I wanted to be sure you at least saw these in case that there was a particular region you wanted. So we obviously went further south. This is from Monterey Bay, and don't really have a point up north as to how far it goes. But you can kind of see the coastline as far as the population density.
And just so we notice there in white, it's, I think, 2.97 miles. Is that the indicator between the two tracks?
Yeah, that's the distance in between the two tracks.
Okay.
The yellow being the surfer and the white being the Big Sur track. And at the coastline, roughly about a 3-mile, 2.97 nautical mile spread between where they came on land.
All right. And on this track, excuse me, on this next slide, rather, you want us to see? Next slide. I'm sorry, going back. One more. There we go.
Oh, yeah,
Thank
this
you.
was the slide before. This is just the northern end from Los Altos Hills to MENLO. Yellow line again being the surfer, white line being the Big Sur track, and then the blue numbers simply the distance between the two tracks, these couple of points that we picked, just to give you a proximity of the two tracks at this time.
Okay. And again, colleagues, we all have the paper versions, the proper versions in our hands now. Comments and questions? I'm going to begin with Mr. Lane.
Thank you. It's useful for me to look at the one in Santa Cruz area just for example, because I recognize the details, and but this may well apply to other areas. But it seems to me that what we've got here is just within a census tract what the population is. Is that correct? As opposed to a true density count.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, because I think it's a little tricky, and I just want to I'll use an example. If you look at the Santa Cruz one, where the word Santa in Santa Cruz is on the zoomed in one there, you can see right in the middle of Santa Cruz, an area that's kind of medium, kind of a beige that isn't dense, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that it's kind of a small tract and not a reflection of its density. Whereas if you go up north of Santa Cruz to where it's not the brightest red, but the orange just north of Santa Cruz there, you'll see that shows a darker color as though that's a high-density population, and yet that isn't. It's just a really big area that is, you know, has, once you take that whole big area,
This is
it has
why I
a
asked
good
the
number of
question
people, but
earlier.
it's not dense.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question earlier about what the numbers meant, and the answer is that's the number of people inside that tract, however big or small, to Mr. Lane's point, the tract may be, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. That's, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding that correctly.
Okay, and Mr. Leopold, let me share the mic with you here.
Thank you. I think this information is, I know we asked for it, so thank you for giving it to us, but I think it doesn't really help us all that much, because I don't think there's anybody who wants to have the problems that we are hearing about now, whether there be a few more people on one way or a few less people. The goal is to reduce the impact. And that's where I think the Class B airspace changes, the change to OPD, and even looking at the Big Sur track where things went for a while without generating the same kind of complaints. That to me is much more important than trying to figure out whether this is the most accurate or not, because I can make cases on either one, and it's the reality may be totally different than what these maps show. That doesn't. What we do know, however, is the kind of impacts that have been reported, and so to the extent that that's real data, that's helpful to us. But I appreciate the information, although I'm not sure it gives us anywhere to go.
Slightly different take, which is I do think that as rough edged as the display may be in terms of helping us know, you know, what's the density and who's where, I do think you look at this and you say to yourself, apropos of questions raised by one of my colleagues previously, is there a better place for the line than either one of those two places? And I think you start to look at this and think, with a little more precise information, such a better line might be found, understanding that there are questions about how long that would take and so on and so forth. So I think from my standpoint, that's the bigger takeaway, while still very much agreeing with Mr. Leopold's comments that, you know, the real goal should be to figure out how to reduce the noise, period, end of story, full stop. Coming down this way, I think I got everybody on this side.
I just wanted to make a brief comment about following up with Supervisor Leopold. I'm really concerned that we're going to be coming to a recommendation, hopefully, pretty soon, and that, you know, until we get a Class B data presented, you know, I'm not sure of the kind of a quality recommendation we could make. I mean, that could change the whole thing of what the solution should be, and we're a year away from that, I guess. It's just a concern I have. I think this is a concern that a lot of us have here, and I just think it needs to be noted that you know, we're going to make a recommendation, but boy, I just 6 months or a year from later, maybe we could have made a better one if we would have had that information. And it's a concern of mine. I think it's a concern of everybody's.
Mr. Martin, do you have any thoughts you or your team might share about the integration of the two conversations, the Class B adjustment approaching the coast in particular, and the Surfer versus Davy J options? I think Supervisor McPherson, not to put too many words in your mouth, you're making the case there's a clear relationship between what we could do with Class B airspace and the advisability of moving forward or not, and at what time as between those two spots. Yes? No? Did I get it right? Okay. Yeah. Let me go to Mr. Martin, and then I'm going to go back to Mr. Leopold.
So the current Class B situation, you know, is something we consider a safety issue. So we, as I've told you, we've proceeded. Unfortunately, it's a regulatory process, and it does take time. I guess what I would share with you is we certainly know that the change that we've proposed would result in fixing the concerns that we currently have on the surfer. We have also looked at that same proposed change to ensure that it would, in fact, be able to encompass a Davy J or something even higher than what we've ran Davy J at. So the interest in proceeding on our part is we believe if those were either of the choices that you make, this change will fix or help both of them.
Mr. Leopold.
And just to follow up, the noise modeling that was done, you did looking at an OPD path on Davy J. When you showed us a couple meetings ago in September, I think you shared with us a bunch of noise modeling information. And wasn't that what the expectation of the Class B airspace change?
I'm trying to make sure I recall the assumptions that we made. I believe that we made the modeling was done with as best of an estimate of an OPD over the Big Sur track as we possibly could have done. And therefore, to answer your question directly, it would have considered a modification of the Class B to ensure that it worked.
And didn't we also look at the modified Class B on the surfer track? And you identified that the planes would go lower and would probably be louder than what the modeling showed under the other track.
I'm afraid I don't recall modeling a revised surfer. I don't believe I've presented anything that presented a modified surfer.
Well, it seems to me that you're already going forward with the Class B airspace changes. So whatever constellation of recommendations that we have will entail those Class B modifications to help achieve true OPD. Is that accurate?
I think the short answer is yes. The Class B modification should allow us to design the procedure and fly it as designed, yes, whichever procedure is recommended.
And the timeline on the the timeline on the Class B adjustments along the coast is what again? I just want to revisit that timeline.
I believe the public meetings on that begin in January. It's typically about a year following that to be modified.
Okay. So just to put it out there, as uncomfortable as it is, if we were to move sooner rather than later on a shift from surfer to notional Davy J, that would happen without the benefits of the Class B airspace adjustment, yes?
I'm going to say the Class B would not be modified, or let me back up and approach it this way. Modifying or implementing let's call it a notional Davy J, not that that was your choice, but if we moved forward to implement a notional Davy J, that would be done far sooner than January of 2018.
I'm going to take that as a yes, thank you.
Okay.
Down the row, Mr. Bodorf, and then Mr. Moody.
With the chair's indulgence, I'd like to go out on a limb a little bit.
Better thee than me, Mr. Bodorf, Court 2.
Okay. Heard a lot of conversation, was able to have some dialogue with Mr. Martin and his staff, and just want to run an idea about you. And this is just an idea and a suggestion, it's not a recommendation. Let's say our goal was relief as soon as possible. I believe that's probably what people have been saying to us. And if we were going to make a recommendation, because what I've heard is rather than us telling you what to do, because we're not experts and you are, it makes sense to me that if we asked you to design something that met all of our needs, we'd be better off than suggesting you something that we don't even know how it's going to work. So there's a concept, okay, and I'm just going to run it by it, and it would read something like this. try to read it slow and trying to not confuse you. Can you make a move back to the Big Sur track that incorporates a change in the Class B airspace that allows for the use of OPD, that ensures that it's higher than the notional AVJ, that utilizes the swell waypoint at 6,000 or higher rather than the concept at MENLO or 4,000, is less impactful to the community below, and minimizes the use of speed brakes?
And preferably tomorrow, by the way, so no, just to be,
Yesterday,
there you go, better said.
I don't find any of those things infeasible. You know, I find all of those things feasible.
No, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, Ms. Broder, follow-up.
That was it. I'm seeing us throwing darts at a board, and it's like we want to use DNL, and we want to use that, and I'm just trying to give the parameters to the FAA to say, we don't want the noise impact. We don't want the speed brakes. We have some guidelines, and can you devise a system? Which, to me, if Mr. Martin tells me that yes to this, then it might be the blue line, okay? I mean, it could be the blue line, I don't know. But all the concerns that we have were about, we have consistently talked about the height, we've talked about the noise. I believe in my location, most of the noise is due to the maneuvers rather than the altitude. I'm trying to go back to some of the things that were successful that I knew about the Big Sur route. And if we go back to the point prior to MENLO, go higher in the mountain, use that as a guideline. Mr. Martin's already suggested some concept about 3 degrees or less. I know that if those planes, if we just say we're going to raise Epic and we're going to raise MENLO, those planes are going to come in steeper. And when they get to the Bay Area, where I'm not, they're going to be putting on their speed brakes, and that's not going to work. So rather than me try to solve this problem, I'm just trying to use everything that everybody in this board has mentioned as what they want and say, okay, FAA, give us a plan that works. And if it ends up being called the Pine Line or the Blue Line or the Smithian Line, I don't care, as long as everybody out there is happy.
We're going to call it the Botter Bundle, just so you know. But I think when you reference that it could be the blue line, it could also be the blue line before the blue line is identified. So if finding a blue line, meaning a sort of a perfect path, is a longer-term challenge, then one possibility is something sooner rather than later while the perfect is still the subject of pursuit. So I just toss that into the conversational mix. Mr. Lane.
I think I'll pass for a moment.
Okay. Mr. Moody, actually, I think I skipped over you. Forgive me.
Well, I had a question that we placed in the parking lot as it related to Davy J and the MENLO waypoint, but given my colleagues' well thought out approach towards this, I'm just going to defer. I think it's a great point, and I think it has merit, and I think it might be a new point on our agenda item for discussion.
Where are we on 50-50 these days, Mr. Martin?
If I can recap our last conversation at the meeting, 50-50 would be a concept in which, again, there may be some other technical ways to do this, but we have we've gotten to a point where there is a lot of discretion given to the airlines to file the route because their computers and their schedules and their fleet mix and their crews and all of the things that they have to make sure arrive at the gate when you're ready to go. Giving them flexibility in their routes is something that we've worked very hard to give them that so that they can plan for their day of business. However, there are times when we certainly can require what we call preferential routes. So I believe the 50-50 concept is similar around perhaps moving down further south, we would say everyone out of the LA basin will file up a Big Sur track, a notional Davy J, whatever it was called at that time. We'll say everyone from the Sacramento area and Phoenix and Texas and so forth that come up this way will file on the Surfer. So, by going through and figuring out how many of those flights that are, obviously I think the intent would be to try and split them 50-50 on the number. So I think that's the general concept. I think technologically wise, as I said, I don't think there's anything that would prevent us from doing that. I think the thing to understand is, it's kind of their broken record. We don't schedule the flights. So I don't want to leave anybody with the concept that we can figure out that who comes up Davy J, the next one's going to be a Surfer. There's no way for us to actually figure that out. But we could certainly schedule them to fly the preferential route 50-50. Again, I don't think that that's operationally, I don't think that that causes, I think we can do that. I will say that I have concerns over that. Even though they're coming up 2 tracks, they will still have to be sequenced. So in this spaghetti bowl, I think as you called it, you're introducing a new route into it. So where we have all of this vectoring, sequencing 3 routes into it, you would be now adding a 4th.
But no additional flights. You're still looking at the same number of flights.
The same number of flights.
And you
it's true.
already have to sequence them because they're already on one path.
Yes, but now they're on 2.
Right, and my point is if one flight is here and one flight is here, you're sequencing them just as you did when one flight was here and one flight was here. You had that necessity before, you'd have that necessity now if you had them on two parallel paths or vaguely parallel paths. We'll sort that out some other time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I certainly don't disagree with you.
Let me hand the mic back to Mr. Leopold.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that vectoring question, because now let's say they get in line at Epic, but if we had the 50-50 and you had the Big Sur and Surfer, they'd be kneading together, I'm not exactly sure where, I'd have to take a look here, but probably in the Mid-Peninsula region. And wouldn't that lead to more vectoring in that area as compared to the, we know about 50% of the flights just on the Surfer, or Big Sur, or even Davy J are going to be vectored. Wouldn't that vectoring happen then closer in the Mid-Peninsula region?
I think there is sequencing, spacing, vectoring, whatever you call it, in order to get them in the one line, as Mr. Smidian said. I think the propensity to run them dually will grow, and so I believe you would be introducing the opportunity for that additional vectoring further north. I think that would end up resulting from that. It's just an opinion, but I think it would be, and all I can do is caution you that that could be an outcome. Yeah. But technically, we could certainly assign them to come up half on each route.
Yeah, it just seems like when they come together, that's when the vectoring happens. That's when we have a bunch of vectoring, and so if they're coming up closer or more north, that you'll have more vectoring. So I appreciate that.
I'm not persuaded of that, but I'll put it in the to be determined category. No, truly, I'm listening, I'm hearing it. I'm not persuaded of that. But I think my takeaway, and feel free to comment or not, but my takeaway is this isn't something that's been given a lot of thought. So what gives me more pause is the fact that it might take a while to do it. I'm inclined to think that it's doable. I just think it hasn't yet been scoped out. So that's one man's view on the subject. On this, we're on the rather large topic of Surfer Star back to Big Sur ground track prior to Epic. So coming down this path, Mr. Moody, nope. Supervisor, Mr. Mayor, no. Ms. Wengert, Mr. Pine, no. Mr. Leopold. Please.
Well, I just want to just add another voice to what my colleague from Capitola brought up. I mean, it seems to me that we do have a bunch of things that are deemed feasible, that can make a difference, that we've identified can be done, and at least with the noise modeling and other pieces in place, we have some idea of what the impact would be. I think everybody's clear that the existing surfer route has great impact and has generated a lot of complaints, and whether that be because topography or the nature of the place where the planes are flying, or the fact that people didn't choose to live under a highway, those are all, however you designate that problem's real. And I would hate for us to have this opportunity to interact with the FAA and miss the opportunity to fix this impact in some kind of meaningful way. And I think that we need to, as we're all concerned about safety, that's a given. We're all concerned, we all understand the complexity of it, and there's a lot of concern about noise, and trying to find some way to be able to assess what the impact of using the Big Sur track with the Davy Bay procedure, that's higher than what was formerly in Big Sur, that has the waypoint. I think he said swells being higher. I think that trying to figure out how we can all feel comfortable with that, and or to make sure that there's a means post implementation to be able to look at the data and interact with the FAA if there's any tweaks that need to be made. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we have that we've talked about, and the chair brought up that maybe we're going to get to that today and try to think about what the long-term or the next relationship with the FAA after the ending of the select committee will help give people some idea that whatever choice this group makes and whatever the FAA can deliver on, if there are unintended consequences, that there's at least some way to have that conversation and make those tweaks so it can really make a difference. So I just wanted to add that voice to my friend from Capitola.
Ms. Bernal.
I agree with everything that Supervisor Leopold and Mayor Butteroff have said. I also think there's one other thing to add beyond the future, and that is in the immediate future, getting Palo Alto on the roundtable, but then also San Francisco roundtable, but then also looking to a regional roundtable, because as we've discovered in working on this committee, this is not just one county, two-county issue, a few cities here, a few cities there. This is traffic, as we've seen in the spaghetti bowl, is affecting all of us. And so we do need to grow and have a larger conversation that includes everyone. Thank you.
Mr. Waldeck, I believe you're next.
Thank you. I wonder if we can bring up some slides that I gave to you. Cash, if you can start with the BSR slide first. One of the things that has bothered me about this whole process is the fact that I've not been able to get an apples-to-apples comparison of what we have versus what we had versus what we got now versus what we propose. And so this is a slide. This is your slide at the top. We just rotated it a little bit, but this is the FAA slide that was presented for noise, for representing BSR. And we've got Santa Cruz on the right, and the endpoint over there is Menlo. The slide below it is the altitude of the nominal flight path along BSR, as well as the ground elevations along the path. And what I wanted to know was, can we go back to the top part of that, please? Thank you. I wanted to know not necessarily the population in boundaries, but the population density. Density is the key here. You know, population over a different area doesn't mean a lot. It's just a number. But when you talk about the numbers of people who are affected, all of a sudden it starts getting real. So now, given that these charts that you have here they're showing us 40 to 45 DNL, 35 to 40, and greater than 45. This is your chart for the BSR slide. Let's go on down to the bottom now, to the third part of this slide, right here, right there. What we did is at the right-hand side of this slide, we put epic, and on the left-hand side over here, you can see about the fourth line in from the left is the point at MENLO. What these are the numbers of people under that ground track. And I think the numbers are telling. What we're seeing is that the number of people affected at the extreme right-hand side, not to say that they're not affected, but this is BSR now, was relatively low. We didn't have a lot of complaints, and that's what it was 2 years ago, roughly. And as you can see, we had a fair number of people in the more populated areas around the bay. Okay. I'm not going to talk about the third slide, but it basically has to do with the number of voters. It's about the same number. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? The one for Surfer, please. And is that what this one is? Yeah, this is Surfer. Same kind of a distribution. We're using apples to apples here now, and this is important. Up until this point, up until this particular set of slides, we've seen BSR and Surfer. We've seen all kinds of other parameters, but using the same thing so we can actually compare the numbers of people affected. We've got your noise chart, FAA's noise chart. We've copied that directly, used it to create this data point. Can we move down a little bit, please, on this chart? That's it. And we got roughly, it's a little lower altitude, which is what Surfer was. This is from your published data. We averaged the altitude as opposed to the range. I think the same ground altitudes, so you can get a sense of just what's there. And let's go down to the next part. Now you can see over here on the right, particularly around the Santa Cruz area and Capitola area, there's a lot more people affected. You can see that very clearly. This is what our red shirt folks here are all about. They've heard it, they don't like it. But it's in the 35 to 40 dB DNL range. But you see the lighter shades here on the left-hand side are on the 40 to 45 range. I'm sorry, is that right? Yeah, 40 to 45. And you took a look at the top part of the chart here. It's got a little gray dot up there. That means greater than 45. We don't have anything here. Now let's go to the third chart, please. By the way, I talked earlier today about some of our technical people. I'm astonished at what they're able to come up with. But they're using your data and databases that are available to you as well as to everybody else in terms of population densities and the rest of it. We get a similar, but this slide shows significant more noise along the path. This is your chart. This is notional Davy J. So the chart you showed several weeks ago. Let's move on down. This part here is almost the same. Keep going, a little more, right there. All of a sudden, we're talking about noise levels greater than 45 dB. And a great many people affected. The numbers, and if you'll take a look here, the people out in the Santa Cruz area are going to be more affected by it as well. I think it's a poor idea. And it's comparisons like this that we need to start making, apples to apples, not apples to oranges like BSR and Surfer. That doesn't make any sense. Surfer has superseded it. Notional Davy J will supersede that. Our assumption here is that it's all OPD, just the way you've described it, Mr. Martin. It's already, Class B is already fixed. This is the best it's going to get. And this is unacceptable. So what I'm suggesting to you here is, this is a process by which we can assess how many people are affected along any particular path that we pick. The databases are there. It's an easy analysis. Draw a line and you can do exactly this for any test you want to make. This is using your own noise data that we didn't have access to, but we have a couple of databases that tend to go along with it. They're slightly different numbers. The point is, this is the impact it's going to have on an awful lot of people up closer. And I find that totally unacceptable. We need to at least spread the load, but we can't make it a hell of a lot worse for those who are already getting it. That's part of what this shows. And the other part of this is that we got to find a way to balance it. That's my presentation.
Whoa, 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 folks. All right, for the record, we're done with that for today, okay? That was it. Really, gang. It's been such a great process, so let's keep it that way. And, you know, I'm sure there will be other points of view that will be thought-provoking along the conversational path. So let's try and keep it totally civil for everyone along the path of this conversation as we head towards November the 17th. Mr. Hindi? Mr. Lane?
Yeah, thank you. I want to, this last thing just reinforces one point that I've made a couple times before, and I want to make sure we pay some attention to it going forward, and that is about how we actually assess noise. You know, that we have, you know, what we've historically used, the FAA has historically used is this sort of averaging approach. And that there's some value in that, but I don't think it's sufficient. And I'm hoping that we will figure out a way to sort of describe something that would go beyond that and ask, you know, and I don't have any specific solution to that, but again, I know we as local officials have, you know, worked with consultants doing work on land use projects where there's an assessment done of peak noise as well as, over average noise. And I think we need to look at that. And the reason I really want to emphasize this is that I just want to, if I remember correctly, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, the FAA using that averaging found that the surfer route would be of minimal impact using that modeling. And we know, everyone in this room knows that didn't really play out very well, that using that modeling is not going to tell us enough about the impact of people on the ground. So if we're going to do something, if we're going to move the path and think about what kind of noise impact there is where that new path is, I think it just has to incorporate some different kind of modeling so that we'll be realistic in our assessment.
All right. I think we've covered the landscape. Mr. Waldeck, you okay? Thanks. So I think that's it for feasibility group 2 today. Obviously, further conversation to be had. Colleagues, what I'm going to do with your permission is jump ahead to next steps, just because I think it's timely given the conversation we've just had, and then we'll go back to other, which is sort of the opportunity to talk about anything that somebody wanted to bring up that just didn't get there. Some announcements, if I can. Announcements number 1. Forgive me if I occasionally feel the need to be the hall monitor at these meetings, but it really is out of a desire to make sure that everybody gets heard, no matter how popular or unpopular their point of view may be. That goes for the committee members as well, and I think the process has served us well that way, and I give great kudos to the public who has, for the most part, I think, shown just tremendous collaborative spirit under difficult circumstances. So I say thank you, and I mean that quite sincerely. I am particularly concerned when we get to the point where there's going to be public comment at a subsequent meeting that we keep that same atmosphere in the room, because these are all folks up here who are supposed to be able to take a little push and shove. Members of the public who come out to share their thoughts really do deserve a safe space in which to do it. So if I seem a little finger waggy from time to time, I apologize for that, but it really is with a desire to kind of keep the space for everybody to participate. Then in terms of process and timing, one important announcement is we had talked about the possibility of scheduling another meeting in addition to the earlier schedule, and we now are in a position to announce that. So the sequence looks like this. We are headed to our next meeting in these same chambers, and I'm going to look to my staff to make sure I don't misspeak, on October the 27th. That is a regular Thursday hearing. It is a working meeting in this room. It will be once again, from 1 to 4, but it is the time at which we've set aside much of the meeting, and perhaps all of it, for public comment on a discussion draft. So we don't know how much of that time will be taken up that day by public comment, as much as we try and encourage folks to focus on the discussion document. You know, they're going to get their 90 seconds and use it as they see fit, and that's fine. But, you know, don't know if we're going to be here an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. My hope is that we don't have a lot of repetitive remarks, that people focus on the discussion draft, what's in it, what isn't in it, what they think should be in it, how they think changes should be made, because this really is the opportunity for the committee to hear back from the public on the discussion draft, which raises the obvious question, what discussion draft would that be? And the answer to that question is, this is the discussion draft that I have referenced previously, which will be released by my office no later than 5 o'clock, close of business, on Friday, the 21st of October. I want to be really clear, and this will be stamped all over the front of it. This is not a set of proposals from either me or my office or from any member of this committee. The key phrase in discussion draft, or the key word rather in discussion draft, is it's for discussion. It is our best effort in my shop to collect areas where we think consensus has been developed based on the conversations we've already had. I'm guessing there'll be some holes in the document because there are some areas where we haven't developed consensus yet. So that's to be expected. I also think, and I want to be very clear as I look out at the community on this, there will be some errors and omissions in the document. That's why we have public comment, and that's why we'll talk about it as a committee, to fix the areas where there are errors and omissions. There is no pride of authorship when this document is released because, again, while it's coming out of my shop because somebody has to produce a document for conversation, it's our best effort to put down in writing what we think we've heard from this committee over the past 4 or 5 months. So if I'll just pick on Mr. Lane because he's looking right at me. Mr. Lane says, you know, Supervisor, I don't think that is even remotely what we came to consensus on. Then that'd be a good time to say, oh, let's talk about where we missed the mark on that. So again, ultimately, this is a document that has to reflect a consensus of this committee. We have defined consensus at that earlier meeting as at least 8 members of this committee with at least 1 member from each of the 3 congressional districts or counties. And this is a discussion document. Now, I know that the reason you're all perfectly delighted to let my office issue this document is because no matter how many times I say it's not a set of proposals from me or my office, that's going to get lost in translation, and I understand that. But again, it's a discussion document. It's our best effort to take what we've heard, collect it, put it in writing. There will be some areas where we don't have anything because we really don't think that there has been a consensus yet. But Mr. Lane, you were among the clearest at the beginning of this process about saying you hoped we really could get to consensus recommendations to the greatest degree possible. And taking that to heart, that's what we will try and reproduce. So that document will be released. It will go to the members of Congress. They will put it up on their websites, I assume, and the world will take a look at it. That'll happen, as I say, no later than the 21st. Then we'll have our meeting on the 27th. That'll be the opportunity for public comment. Then we anticipate that since much of that meeting will be used with public comment, we probably will need a little more time for this committee to actually talk about what's in writing and or to bring their own proposals or alternatives or whatever. That's why we have scheduled an additional meeting on November the 3rd, which is a Thursday. We'll be here. The one change is I believe we've got it scheduled for 2 o'clock in order to accommodate schedules for folks throughout the area. I don't want to speculate about how long that will go, but I would say this is perhaps a meeting that you shouldn't count on being just 3 hours. That would be my own best judgment about that. Then after that meeting, we will come back for what we hope, plan is a final meeting on the 17th, vote on the document, pack it up, call it a day, and hand those recommendations over to the members of Congress and ask them to wrestle the FAA to the ground on the recommendations that are contained in the finally approved document. So that is the current plan, timeline, chart. Questions or changes? Yes, Mr. Lane.
I just wanted to see if in your gathering the material, in addition to identifying the points where you perceive there might be some good consensus, will you also list sort of the key points where there isn't, just to make sure that we can also, focus on trying to fill in that blank through the public comment and through our future discussion?
As we have begun this conversation in my office, I can tell you that, let me just pick some easy ones. I think it's a pretty good guess that you're not going to see a recommendation consensus identified around Davy J and Surfer in the document that comes on the 21st. I think the conversation today suggests that we're not yet finished with that discussion. I've referenced earlier today the need for an ongoing entity to take up these issues. We have talked about that repeatedly. It seems to me there's very clear consensus that calling it a day on November 17th and hoping the world is a better place is probably not the option that this committee is inclined to suggest. There are some other areas where I would say my assessment of the committee, and I've spent some quality time with the tapes to try and read between the lines on some of this. My sense is that in some other areas, the committee's view is, gee, we'd like to do this, but if only, and we don't know what the answer to the if only is, so therefore we're not yet ready to make a recommendation, but could we take a look at that? And so I've tried to think about what's on that list of items as well that might be folded in. And again, this is an attempt not to put forward recommendations from me or my office. My responsibility in my view, is to be the honest broker for the committee. If there's something that's 11 to 1 and I'm in the 1, then it should be in there if that's the consensus of the committee. But there are some areas where I don't think we've yet developed consensus, or where consensus would be conditional on information that we either don't have or probably won't have between now and the 17th of November.
Joe,
Questions about this process? Hang on just a minute, Mr. Waldock. I just want to make sure that we got Mr. Lane's questions responded to.
Is the 11 to 1 number solid, or I'm just checking?
No, we'll see what I think, Mr. Lane, I have to tell you just, as part of this conversation, I was less optimistic than you about the potential for developing real consensus. As the process has gone on, I've actually become much more optimistic. I think your initial read of the potential to develop consensus was a more accurate one, and I also think it was, in my view, an important exhortation to us all to try and find those kinds of paths rather than to be worried about getting the bare majority necessary to move an item. Anything else on this side, Mr. Leopold?
I think this process seems like a good one. The question I have, and maybe it's really for Mr. Hindi, we didn't get a presentation of something. I don't know what that is. And I'm wondering if maybe you could give us some idea of what that is, because if we're going to take public comment, it'd be nice to have everything on the table. So I don't know what it is. It would be great for the public to know what it is.
Yeah, the presentation specifically about Foster City proposed solution. It's nothing to deal with the Davy J or anything on the MENLO. Whatever we would be suggesting would be specifically over Foster City and over the Bay, will not have impact on any other communities by our suggestion. Thank you.
Comments or questions running down this aisle? Mr. Pine, Ms. Wengert, Ms. Bodoff. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I just want to take off on your talk that was very inspirational, and I just want to add one more upbeat comment for all of us to focus on. I just happened to pull out this definition of consensus off Wikipedia. Okay, and it's meant to be inspirational.
Does it say 8 votes with 1 from at least each of 3 counties? Is that what it says?
This is a positive comment. I want us all to, and it's one sentence. Okay, it's real simple. It says, consensus is the community resolution when opposing parties set aside their differences and agree on a statement that is agreeable even if only barely. Even if only barely. So,
And Supervisor? No, Mr. Moody?
Yes, given the comments and the tone of the conversations, I think I have a need to kind of revisit my my question about the pros and cons of the Davy J on the peninsula. Now, we can table that for the next meeting, or we can raise that.
No, and I apologize, I have a note to myself that we need to get back to that question. So,
Okay.
but given sort of where we landed on this surfer Davy J conversation, I wanted to lay out sooner rather than later sort of what the next steps were so that everyone was clear and hopefully agreeable, and I'm sensing that people think that's a acceptable path to getting us to a resolution on the 17th.
Okay.
I will say, I think what we don't know, and we should just acknowledge that we don't know it, is there are at least a couple of different scenarios for the meeting on the 17th. This could be so well worked through that we come back on the 17th, we have a list of a couple dozen recommendations, we march through them, we vote, we have consensus on everything, and we're out the door in an hour, hour and a half. Or it could still have significant pieces that are what I'd call a work in progress that we're still going to be debating right up until the last minute of the meeting. And so it could be a 3-hour, 4-hour, 5-hour meeting where we're trying to wrestle some of those things to the ground. I genuinely don't think I know, and I think it would be hard to know, how much progress we're going to make and at what rate. That depends on, bluntly, how good a job we did of capturing the consensus where we thought it exists, and if we did a bad job on that, then it's going to take us a little longer. It also depends on what we hear from the community, obviously, which is why we're taking the community comment on the 27th. It also then depends on, additional areas of agreement as we go forward, and we're going to be pulling our friends here at the FAA into those conversations, I'm guessing, because as we say, well, what about this or what about that? We're going to be tossing questions their way in those final couple of meetings. So I think we genuinely don't know what the last meeting or two will look like on the 3rd and the 17th in terms of time and ease of solutions. Mr. Pine?
So, Mr. Chair, I have great confidence in the discussion draft that your office will produce. I'm glad you're doing it. But as a suggestion, and there's recommendations that I think when I hear the word recommendation, I think of a specific change. But there's also some principles that I could foresee the report articulating. And for me, for example, I've written down 3. I think 2 of the 3 are non-controversial. Maybe one may be controversial. Like one is, noise needs to be given substantially greater weight when designing airspace. It's more important than efficiency. Secondly, in my view, anyway, this one may have differing opinions, that noise needs to be dispersed. A small number of communities should not have a disproportionate share if there are ways to avoid the noise or distribute the noise. And 3, late night flights cannot be disruptive, period. So there are certain principles, I wonder, a little different than recommendations, because they don't, solving these, we know how incredibly difficult that is. But in communicating to the FAA, with all respect, and our congressional members, I think there are certain higher level things that we should really emphasize.
All right. Duly noted, and as I say, when the document comes, people want to offer proposals, amendments, that's what the process is for. And your comments also reminded me, I should have underscored something that we said at the beginning of this process, but that hasn't been said recently, which is, just to be clear, our recommendations are going to 3 members of Congress. They are not, as a technical matter, going to the FAA. Now, they've been in the room from day one, and they've been hearing all this, and I think that's all to the good. But just as a sort of a practical matter, as I referenced earlier, just in passing, our recommendations, when voted on and presumably approved on the 17th of November, go to the 3 members of Congress, and then the challenge falls to them to say, thank you for your recommendations. Time for us to sit down again with the FAA and talk about how we can make real progress sooner rather than later. Okay? That being said, let's go back then, and we do have a little bit of time left. Let's go back to the question, and Mr. Moody, I heard you say, you know, all this surfer Davy J conversation has been important, but it's been primarily, not exclusively, primarily focused on impact on the coast and in the immediate vicinity of the coast, but not so much what a change might mean for folks in the peninsula or the mid-peninsula. Did I get it right? You got it right. Okay. Mr. Martin, so what would it mean for folks in the peninsula or the mid-peninsula, depending on how we define that?
I guess I got lost there when you repeated his question. I thought his question was, what are the advantages of the Davy J? Was that his?
Most particularly in Mr. Moore's area, which is the peninsula.
Okay. I think, I think to be clear, operationally, having found by looking at what we call the notional Davy J and finding it feasible, I don't think the FAA has a preference over the flight path track. We believe we could do either. We're doing one, and we did the other. We believe we could do either. So operationally, I don't think there's an advantage to us. Just wanted to be clear on that, okay? The advantages to the Davy J at the mid or upper peninsula, I think, are number one, again, as we've shown, the aircraft that would come up the Davy J, all things being equal, would only be about 15% that fly that route all the way to that last waypoint to go in. And so as we discussed today, I don't think that is the one and only thing. And again, I'm focusing up peninsula here. If we can get out of the Santa Cruz Mountains for a minute, focusing up north where essentially they've come together, if you from the pictures. I think either one, I don't know that one is advantageous over the other. Short of reviewing some of the population density, issues, I think that operationally there's certainly no difference. I think what I've tried to communicate today, specifically around the MENLO conversation, is I don't see that the Davy J in and of itself addresses the north side of this. I think we need to be sure if we were to, whatever arrival comes from the south, the altitudes around that end need to be addressed because of the impact that they're feeling having sustained the change of surfer and crossing MENLO at 4. So I think that has to change. But because of the amount of traffic in that area that does not affect, it's these other things that were suggested around Bodega balancing. Are we coming in for the flights over the ocean effectively? Are we specifically addressing the nighttime flights? I think all of that, all of those things are required to address the further north communities. It's specifically not about the benefits of just a Davy J.
How would you respond to the community that has a very strong opposition to Davy J?
How would I respond to a community that had opposition to Davy J?
Right.
Are we thinking of someone in particular, or just any of them that chose?
Well, there's a pro and con approach conversation about Davy J that's impacting all 3 counties right now, and all of us, I believe, are getting inundated with a lot of information from both sides, and I'm just looking for some clarity as to the FAA's position.
I'm going to jump in again, and don't let me take you off track, but the email traffic is heavy. I checked one of my correspondents who has now sent their 27th email on the subject. And on the one hand, we want to encourage people to communicate, and they certainly have taken that encouragement to heart. That being said, speaking only for myself, I'm not counting noses here. I'm trying to get to the best judgment I can for the most people. Hence the somewhat serious conversation about total persons aggravated. How often are they aggravated? How greatly are they aggravated? But as much as I appreciate the emails from folks who have all points of view, I don't see my role as nose counting. I see my role as sifting and sorting through the arguments that folks are making. Go to Davy J, don't go to Davy J. So back to Mr. Moody's question, I think what many of us may be wrestling with is the very question that he's raised and brought to the fore, which is, all right, so what are the arguments for Davy J or against Davy J if you are a Mid-Peninsula resident? Is that where we're headed? Thank you. No, I really credit you with sort of bringing that to a focal point. But I know I'm struggling with this, as I say, because it's great to get the communication, but you're looking for the information in the communication, not just keeping a tally, as I say.
And I think that's where I'm struggling. The answer is, where are we talking? I mean, there is a difference in that track by 3 miles. So I think further south, it was.
Let me try it this way.
Difference in that. So,
no, I mean, if you're Mr. Moody lives in East Palo Alto.
Yep.
I live in Palo Alto. So if you're a Palo Alto resident or an East Palo Alto resident, what are the pros and cons of the shift to Davy J for the folks in those two communities, the places we live and where we represent people? I represent people in 7 or 8 other communities, but let's just take those two communities. They're right next door to each other.
I think I do not believe the Surfer Davy J choices, for me, have any effect that far north. The effects of the impacts to the communities that far north are a combination of factors. And I think if you see the tracks here, once you're up as far north as Palo Alto, MENLO, or you just skip around slides, whichever you're doing. Closest in up there? No, I want to go to the population.
You had it.
So as you can see, being less than a quarter of a mile apart by the time we get to Stanford, again, this is where I'm projecting you're wanting me to look. I don't think that shift is going to be great. Remembering like 15% of the people will be on that track. Everyone else will be vectored in that area. And that's why I've said I don't think there's for me, I don't think there's a significant Davy J. Surfer decision in those areas.
Yeah, but isn't there a population density piece that needs to be factored into this? I mean, the population in that region is probably close to over 1 million people.
And you're saying the quarter of a mile could be substantial? I mean, is that what I'm understanding?
Well, I think there's many who would think that Santa Clara County and San Mateo County has the highest density of population in this conversation. And the impacts are obviously felt by a greater number of people. Now, I'm not trying to move the issue, but I am trying to speak to our constituents and their concerns.
Mr. Moody, could I ask, since I keep stealing half of your question, if not more, if we go to the other population density map that just one level out, thank you. This is why on a previous map, if you looked at I'll call it almost a straight line south from where the MENLO waypoint is, that swings the Big Sur notional Davy J line a little bit to the left. a little bit more, and then go north, straight north. And you start to ask yourself, is there a way to avoid some of these population centers? It's a fair question. And here's the answer I think you've given us. That's an interesting question, and it would take us some time to figure that out. I think that's the answer you've given us. And I don't mean that in anything other than a straight-up way. You've said, you know what, we have been focused on Surfer and just to get it out there again, the clearly unacceptable nature of the noise impacts on Surfer, and the alternative of Davy J, which is sort of a variation on Big Sur. And so Mr. Pine asked the question, you know, is there a place that might be ideal rather than letting ourselves be limited to these binary choices? And I think Mr. Moody's question is, you know, very much part and parcel of the same challenging conversation, which is, can we do better? And what I heard you say is maybe, but it would take us some time to figure that out. And you didn't say it, but implicit in that, in my view, was, would you like to do something sooner rather than later while we're figuring it out? And that goes to Mr. Podorf's comments as well, it seems to me. So, but Mr. Moody, I'm going to let you get your own question back again, but I sort of wanted to piggyback on it a little bit that way, and I appreciate it.
Well, I think it's most important for me to pose the question today in this forum and give you an opportunity to kind of speak to the pros and cons for our region, so I can have something to carry back, and especially in light of, you know, some of the input we're getting from the community and the technical expertise is certainly appreciated by me, but I think oftentimes it's a little bit above my learning curve, and I humbly submit that. So I'm just trying to get to a place of layman terms where we can articulate what are the pros and cons back to our community. Why Davy J? Maybe why not? And what other things do we need to take into consideration as we move forward?
All right, before I go to Mr. Waldeck, I want to make sure we don't lose this thread. I am going to ask Mr. Martin if you can work with our office and the committee on sort of further refining the conversation about population and impacts. And you've brought us new information today that I think was helpful. Mr. Waldeck has brought us some hot off the presses information that I think you're going to want to take some time to scrutinize. But I do think it's important that we continue to have that conversation and figure out what we do with that information as we refine it. So going back down the row here on this issue, Mr. Waldeck.
Yeah, I want to make sure that everybody in the room understands where I'm coming from. I'm data-driven. My background is engineering. I'm a pilot. And I look at numbers, and I try to take a look and see what's the most equitable solution we've got. Given a choice between Surfer and Davy J, I think the data shows one thing. But I very much like Supervisor Pine's concept of, is there another idea? This chart that you have on the screen right now, as Supervisor Siminian has already said, makes a great impact. And if you can take a look just a little bit to the north and west there, a different path over fewer people is going to come down to, in effect, a much smaller portion of our population that might ultimately be affected. This violates one of the fundamental rules we've been trying to do. We've got some conflicting rules we've tried to set up. First one is don't move noise. The second one is fewest number of people, effective fewest number of people possible. And that's a built-in conflict. But I tend to think that in terms of densities and the numbers of people affected and so forth, there's got to be a solution here where we can do things like I like the idea of slowing down over Monterey Bay and then gliding in. Seeing the difference on that 747 last weekend was stunning to me. We can do things like that, but we have a huge impact. We've got to fix Class B. We've got to get to an OPD. I'm in full agreement with that. And I know that even that would take a year or so minimum. But if we can move that line a little, guess what? We can bring them in further over the coast, have them slow down, glide right on in, and ultimately the same place. And again, the noise is going to drop like a stone. That's what we're trying to get to, of the best solution possible. So my comments dealing with Davy J or Surfer or any other route at this point, I just say one's better than the other. But that doesn't mean that's the answer we're looking for. It means that we need to keep looking. That's what I wanted to say.
Last call, and we're sort of in other land here. So, Ms. Wenger.
I just want to follow up on what Supervisor Pine said, and because, for you, Chair Simonian, as you're starting the draft, because I think one of the critical issues here that needs to be surfaced as a principle, and it's been touched on by a few, and you just touched on it, Mr. Waldeck, but the roundtable, for instance, has always carried the precept that noise should not be shifted. And if we look at this situation that's been created, it really resulted from the beginnings of implementation of the next gen with Surfer, Big Sur being obviously a very significant route, and the implications coming from that. You all are the noise monitors. We know, we understand what's been going on out there. So in my mind, the sort of, as you just suggested, there's an inherent conflict between the fair dispersion of noise with not moving noise. But one idea related to what we're struggling with on this one might be instructing the FAA to go back and essentially restore Big Sur. I know they don't like the concept going back. I know they don't like the concept of going back to Big Sur. But because we don't fully understand and may not have the time and ability to fully understand what the impact of moving it anywhere else would be, with a secondary phase and future phases that are really focused on longer-term solutions to this and other issues that are going to be identified and recommended, I would just suggest that that may be an approach that could potentially work in this situation. And it's following up on what Mr. Bodar said. So,
Mr. Pine? Lights on? No? Last call? Then, coincidentally, the hour of 4 o'clock has arrived. I'm going to do one last thing here. So I see all this pent-up enthusiasm in the audience, so why don't we take this opportunity for you to applaud and cheer for whatever your point of view may be, all right? Meeting is adjourned.